Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are leaving behind the ordinary hum of your bedroom and stepping into a world wrapped in velvet, gold leaf, and a slowly rising sense of dread. We are traveling to the Russian Empire in the years just before the First World War, the last golden autumn of a civilization that did not know it was already dying. Palaces with more rooms than families, tables groaning under food nobody needed, and outside the frosted windows, a country of 130 million people quietly running out of patience. Before we begin, a warm thank you to everyone who requested this particular era in the comments. Your appetite for the slow, glittering collapse of doomed empires is remarkable, and this channel exists because of exactly that kind of curiosity. If tonight's journey helps you drift off, that is precisely the point, so get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your mind settle into something warm while we walk together through a world that is, quite literally, living on borrowed time. Let's begin with a question worth sitting with in the dark. What did it actually feel like to be born into that kind of fortune, in that particular country, in that particular decade? Not wealthy in the abstract, safely far away sense we imagine today, but wealthy in a nation still shackled to the memory of serfdom, wealthy while sitting a few short years from a war that would kill millions, and closer still to a revolution that would erase your entire way of life within a single winter. Would you have noticed the warning signs? Would you have mistaken the silence of your servants for loyalty and the quiet of your peasants for contentment? Or would you, like almost everyone in your position, have simply kept dancing? You are about to find out, because tonight you are opening your eyes in the year 1913, in a bedroom the size of a small ballroom, inside an empire that has no idea it is about to end. Settle in. This is going to be a long, cold, glittering night. The waking hour there is no alarm clock in your world, because there is no need for one. Instead, you surface slowly from sleep into the quiet awareness that you are not alone, that you have not, in fact, been alone at any point during the night. Somewhere near the door, a manservant or lady's maid has been standing for some time, patient as furniture, waiting for the precise moment your breathing changes to signal that the day may officially begin. A fire is already burning in the hearth. It was lit hours before dawn by someone whose name you have never bothered to learn, someone who rose in pitch darkness so that your first conscious breath of the day would not be a cold one. And this is where the first uncomfortable truth of your existence reveals itself. Despite the fire, despite the thick down coverlets, despite the small fortune spent on draperies and carpets, your palace is cold. Bitterly, permanently cold. These enormous residences were built to overwhelm the eye, not to hold in heat, and no quantity of rubles has yet solved the basic physics of a Russian winter pressing against 300 rooms of poorly insulated stone. You may be the wealthiest person for 100 miles in any direction, and you will still watch your own breath curl in front of your face before you have even left the bed. Your maid or valet approaches now. The curtains are drawn, revealing a gray, indifferent sky. A basin of water, warm to a temperature someone else decided was correct, is brought for you to wash in. You will not fetch this water yourself. You will not, in fact, do very much of anything yourself today or any day. There is no stumbling half asleep toward a kettle, no bleary scroll through the morning's troubles. There is only the unhurried, prearranged unfolding of a schedule built entirely around your comfort by people you will barely acknowledge. Somewhere far below, in a kitchen you have perhaps visited twice in your life, your breakfast is already taking shape, prepared by hands you would not recognize if you passed them in a hallway. And here is the peculiar contradiction sitting at the center of your entire existence. You are, on paper, the most powerful person in this enormous building. In practice, you are almost entirely helpless. You could not light your own fire. You could not prepare your own food. If every servant in this house disappeared by morning, you would likely not survive the week. This is not an accident. It is the entire design. A life this cushioned, this thoroughly managed, produces a particular kind of person, one whose hands have never done anything harder than hold a teacup, and whose greatest daily struggle is deciding how to fill the empty hours ahead. But before you can face any of that, you must first be introduced properly to the small army waiting just beyond your bedroom door. An army that serves you completely and understands you rather better than you understand it. The household beneath you lets count them, or at least attempt to. There is the valet who dresses you and the lady's maid who dresses your wife. There are footmen chosen partly for their height, because a tall footman standing behind a chair simply looks more impressive, which is, in truth, most of the job description. There is a cook, and beneath the cook, a small platoon of undercooks and kitchen boys. There are coachmen and stable hands for the horses, gardeners for grounds most of the family rarely walks, laundresses, a housekeeper who runs the whole operation like a small, silent government, and maids whose entire function is to serve the maids who serve you. A great aristocratic household in this era might employ anywhere from several dozen to several hundred people. An entire working village folded quietly beneath your roof, laboring so that you never have to think about how anything gets done. It is, in a strange sense, the largest support network imaginable, except that none of its members are permitted to speak to you as equals, or complain, or ask anything of you in return. And here is the detail that will matter enormously later, though you cannot see it yet. Every one of these people is studying you far more carefully than you are studying them. Consider the sheer scale of specialization involved. One servant exists only to tend the fires. Another polishes silver and touches nothing else. There are maids devoted entirely to gowns, and maids devoted to the maids who handle the gowns, a chain of labor so long it nearly loops back on itself. You could live in this house for a decade and never learn every name attached to it, and frankly, you have no real intention of trying. Their world runs parallel to yours but almost never touches it. While you occupy painted ceilings and gilded halls, the staff move through a second, hidden building folded inside the first, narrow back staircases, cramped attic rooms, cold basement kitchens. They wake before you and sleep long after you. They eat what remains from your table, and they see everything: your moods, your debts, your quarrels, the precise temperature of your marriage. To you, they are convenient and mostly invisible. To them, you are the single most studied subject in their daily lives. You tell yourself, of course, that the relationship is warm, even familial, that your old nurse loves you as her own, that your footmen take genuine pride in serving such a distinguished family. And some of that is real. Genuine affection does exist inside these households, built up over years of shared proximity. But you have made the easy mistake of the comfortable, assuming that silence means satisfaction. No one is going to tell you to your face that scrubbing your floors for wages that barely feed their own children breeds a particular, patient kind of resentment. That isn't how any of this works. Beneath the surface, a quiet arithmetic is being performed in servants' halls and kitchen corners across the empire. Every person below stairs can see exactly how wide the gap has grown between your floor and theirs. And every year, that gap looks a little less like the natural order of the universe, and a little more like a decision someone made, a decision someone else is still paying for. The dangerous new ideas beginning to spread through this empire. And we will get to them properly later tonight and travel fastest exactly here, in servants' quarters and laundry rooms, passed along in whispers over the washing. The people who know your household's every secret are precisely the people the coming century is trying hardest to recruit, but none of that concerns you yet this particular morning. Right now, your only immediate problem is considerably more pressing. You must be dressed. And dressing in your world is not something you do. It is something that is done to you by a small and highly organized team. The ceremony of getting dressed if you are a woman of this household. Your morning begins with the corset, an engineering marvel built entirely around the idea that comfort is optional and posture is not. It is laced, then laced again, then laced a third time, until your ribs have been persuaded into a shape nature never intended, and your breathing has downgraded from a reliable bodily function to something closer to a polite suggestion. Fashion demands this silhouette, and fashion in your world is never optional. Beneath the outer gown come chemises, more petticoats than seems architecturally necessary, and finally the dress itself. And over the top of everything, furs, because winter in this empire lasts for the better part of the calendar year, and your magnificent home, as already established, is essentially a beautifully decorated icebox. The fabrics are extraordinary: imported silk, hand-worked lace stitched by seamstresses who ruin their eyesight so that you might sparkle at dinner. A single gown might cost more than a working family earns across several years, and you own so many that you have long since lost track of the total. You will wear this outfit only until midday. Then you will change for visiting. Then again for dinner. Possibly a fourth time if the evening brings an engagement worth dressing for. Your wardrobe, in short, keeps a far busier schedule than you do. If you are a man, your ordeal takes a different shape but offers no more comfort. You are buttoned into a military-style uniform, because most men of your rank hold some nominal commission, whether or not they have ever come near actual danger, or laced into a stiff frock coat with a collar so rigid it holds your chin at a permanent, faintly disapproving angle. Every crease must be immaculate. A wrinkled cravat is not a small mistake. It is a public statement about the state of your family's fortunes, and in this world, your family standing is very nearly the only currency you possess. And here, quietly, is the joke buried inside the whole exhausting ritual. For all the money, all the imported cloth, all the hours of skilled labor poured into wrapping you in the finest textiles in Europe, you are still, unmistakably, cold. The furs help. The layers help. But nothing fully defeats a Russian palace in January. You are, in the end, the most elegantly dressed shivering person on the continent. A small fortune spent on the privilege of being tastefully uncomfortable, fully assembled at last, laced, buttoned, and faintly out of breath. You are ready to descend the grand staircase and begin the day's true occupation, eating a breakfast that will represent more food and more expense than most of your countrymen see in a month. A breakfast the size of a small fortune breakfast arrives on silver trays, carried by servants who bow in a dining room whose ceiling is itself a painted masterpiece, at a table long enough to seat a small regiment. There is coffee. There is hot chocolate. There are pastries whose recipes traveled directly from Paris. There is caviar, because of course there is caviar. And there is, without question, far more food laid out than your household could possibly eat, which is not an oversight. It is the entire point. Waste in your world is not accidental. Waste is a performance. If you glanced honestly out through the frosted glass, you might see people for whom this single meal represents an unimaginable fortune. But you will not glance out the window, because someone has already drawn the curtains and quietly refilled your cup. It is remarkably easy to forget about an entire country when good drapery stands permanently between you and it. The scale is genuinely difficult to convey to a modern mind trained to expect a meal proportional to hunger. This is not that. This is abundance staged as theater. Eggs prepared 4 different ways, smoked fish and cold meats, fresh bread, honey, preserves, fruit that traveled enormous distances to reach a frozen country in the dead of winter, and is priced accordingly. Tea flows endlessly from the great silver samovar, the one genuinely Russian object on a table otherwise dressed up as French. And most of it, in the end, will be carried away barely touched, destined for the staff or simply discarded. You eat lightly, partly thanks to the corset, and partly because eating with real appetite is considered faintly common. The point was never for you to actually consume this spread. The point was for it to exist, gleaming and excessive, silent proof that your household can summon this kind of display every single morning without a second thought. Any guest arriving unannounced must find a table dressed for a festival. Anything less would be a social embarrassment your family's reputation might not survive. And where, precisely, does all of this come from? The game and the fish from your own estates. The exotic fruit and fine coffee shipped in at extraordinary cost. The French pastries from a chef whose salary alone could support several ordinary households. Your breakfast, in other words, is the visible tip of an enormous, invisible supply chain stretching across a continent and deep into your own family's land. All of it converging on this single table, so that you might pick at a roll and leave the rest. the effort behind it is utterly invisible to you. It simply appears, the way water appears the moment you turn a tap, and you have thought about its origin about as often. This is the quiet moral blind spot sitting at the center of your entire life. You have been raised to believe this abundance is natural, permanent, simply the background condition of being who you are. It has never once occurred to you that it depends entirely on millions of people continuing to grow the grain, haul the crates, and accept, without much complaint, that the fruits of all that labor should pile up here, to be admired for a moment and then thrown away. It is a beautiful arrangement, provided nobody down the chain ever pauses to do the arithmetic. You finish, dab your lips, and rise from the table. The real business of your day is only just beginning, and it will unfold, as your entire life does, in a language that does not belong to the country stretching out beyond your windows. You descend into the receiving rooms, and the first thing anyone would notice about your household, if they thought to notice it at all, is the language drifting from every doorway. It is not Russian. For generations now, families like yours have conducted the whole of their private lives in French, the language of love letters, of gossip, of elegant cruelty delivered with a smile. Whatever Russian you speak is clumsy and functional, reserved almost entirely for issuing orders to the people who work for you. You dream in French. You quarrel in French. You read French novels about French people worrying over French problems that have nothing to do with the enormous, freezing country outside your window. It is rather like living your whole life in a house whose actual address you have never bothered to learn. This runs deeper than fashion. From your earliest memories you were raised by a French governess, later handed off to an English tutor, and French became the language of the drawing room, the dinner table, the private note slipped between lovers. Russian, by contrast, belonged to the kitchen and the stable yard. In the most fashionable families, children grow up genuinely more fluent in the tongue of Paris than in the tongue of their own birthplace, and to speak Russian too naturally, too easily, carries a faint whiff of embarrassment, the unmistakable mark of someone who has spent rather too much time among the help. The habit reaches back nearly 2 centuries, to the moment your ancestors decided that true civilization lived somewhere west of here, and that Russia itself, vast, cold, and stubbornly complicated, needed improving through imported French manners, French architecture, French philosophy. So your class built itself a small transplanted Europe and settled inside it, forever gazing toward Paris while physically standing in the middle of Russia. You summer on the French Riviera. Your gowns come from French ateliers. You quote French thinkers you have, if you are honest, only half read. You are, in every meaningful cultural sense, a permanent tourist in your own country. This produces something genuinely strange when you stop to consider it. 2 entirely different Russias occupying the exact same territory. There is your Russia, French-speaking, Western-facing, cosmopolitan, and floating a comfortable few feet above the actual ground. And there is the other Russia, the vast, overwhelming majority of it, which speaks real Russian, prays in Russian, sings and suffers in Russian, and has never once had a conversation with anyone from your world that was not in some form and order. You share a country with these people and very little else. You are neighbors who cannot understand one another, divided by a wall of your own quiet construction. For now, none of this feels like a problem. It feels like sophistication, like belonging to a refined international elite rather than being stuck in some backward corner of Europe. It is simply, you tell yourself, what cultured people do. But language is never only words. Language is belonging, and to speak French while the nation around you speaks Russian is to announce, every single time you open your mouth, that you consider yourself a different and finer species of person than everyone standing outside your gates. People notice that. They notice it for a very long time, and they file it away quietly, waiting. So when the reckoning eventually arrives, and it is coming, sooner than anyone in these rooms would like to believe, one of the many charges leveled against your class will be exactly this, that you were strangers in your own homeland, that you drew everything the country produced up into your palaces and could not even be bothered to learn the language of the people producing it. It will be a difficult charge to argue against. You will not have the words to defend yourself. Or rather, you will have them just in the wrong tongue entirely. Which brings us, naturally, to the uncomfortable question sitting beneath every gilded surface in this house. Where does all of this money actually come from? Nobody at your breakfast table enjoys discussing it, which is usually the surest sign that the answer is not a comfortable one. The answer is land. Enormous, inherited, seemingly endless stretches of it, worked for generations by peasant families whose grandparents were, within living memory, legally owned. Serfdom was only abolished in 1861, a little over half a century before this very morning, and everyone in your world quietly agreed to preserve the essential shape of the old arrangement while changing its name. Your fortune grows directly out of that soil, and out of the backs of people whose names you will never trouble yourself to learn. You did not build it. You inherited it, the way one inherits a family trait or an unfortunate habit passed down without consent. And the entire towering structure of your comfortable existence rests on one increasingly fragile assumption, that the people working those fields will simply continue agreeing to the arrangement, indefinitely, without complaint. It is worth pausing here, because serfdom is the ghost seated quietly at every feast in this house. Before 1861, the majority of Russia's rural population belonged, in a very literal legal sense, to the noble families who owned their land. They could be bought, sold, gambled away at the card table, or relocated according to their landlord's convenience, tracked in estate ledgers somewhere between the livestock and the timber inventory. This is the foundation your family's wealth was built upon, and it was built astonishingly recently. Your own grandfather remembers it clearly because he lived through it. Then came emancipation. The Great Reform meant to draw a clean, bright line between a shameful past and a fairer future. In practice, the line was far blurrier than the history books suggest. Freed peasants were granted land, yes, but they were required to pay for it, saddled with decades of redemption payments that replaced the old legal chains with new financial ones. The nobility, meanwhile, retained the richest land and the greater share of the compensation. So the peasant walked out of formal bondage and directly into a debtor's version of the very same arrangement. Same landlord, same field, same empty stomach, only now dressed up as a business transaction. Freedom, it turned out, had come with a payment plan attached, and your class simply carried on exactly as before. The estate kept producing grain, timber, and rents. Money kept flowing upward into your drawing rooms and back out again toward Paris. You never needed to work that land, or even manage it particularly well, or visit it more than once or twice a year. You needed only to own it and collect what it yielded. Many noble families, in fact, proved remarkably poor at the actual business of running an estate, accumulating staggering debts while living lavishly beyond their means, quietly mortgaging their grandchildren's future to keep this season's ballroom candles lit. Being wealthy in your world was less a skill than an inheritance being slowly, elegantly spent down to nothing. Here is the part that ought to trouble you, if you were the sort of person inclined to lie awake thinking about such things, which, to be fair, you are not. Your entire way of life depends on a single ongoing agreement you never actually negotiated. The agreement of millions of people beneath you to keep producing wealth and keep sending it upward, decade after decade, in exchange for very little in return. As long as those people believe there is no alternative, the arrangement holds firm. The moment they stop believing that, the moment someone persuasive enough tells them the land could simply belong to them instead, the entire beautiful structure has nothing left propping it up but old habit. And habits, it turns out, can shatter far faster than anyone expects. So before we return to the glittering distractions waiting for you this afternoon, it is worth taking one honest, unhurried look at the people your comfort actually depends on, the enormous, patient majority you have spent your whole life managing not to see. The Russian peasant is the largest single fact of the empire you live in, and very possibly the smallest thought occupying your own mind. If you picture them at all, you likely imagine simple, devoted, grateful people, humming contentedly at their labor and thankful for your family's benevolent presence nearby. This is an extremely comforting fantasy, and almost entirely divorced from reality. Down in the villages, a slow and patient resentment has been fermenting for decades, distilled the way something strong and homemade is distilled, quietly, steadily, out of sight. You cannot smell it yet from inside your warm drawing room. But it is fermenting all the same, and one day the fumes will reach even you. Consider, honestly, what their daily lives actually look like, since you have almost certainly never bothered to look before. A typical peasant family lives in a small wooden hut in a village not unlike thousands of others scattered across the empire, huddled around a great clay stove in winter simply to survive nights that would otherwise kill them. Labor is dictated entirely by the seasons, and the seasons do not care whether anyone is tired. Farming begins at first light and does not meaningfully stop. There is the constant, gnawing threat of a poor harvest, and there is the ever-present arithmetic of hunger, because famine in this empire is not some distant historical horror confined to textbooks. It is a recurring visitor, familiar enough to be expected. When crops fail, entire regions starve, even as grain that might have saved them is loaded onto ships and exported to pay for luxuries very much like the ones filling your own dining room. Their world is narrow, and their burdens are immense. There are taxes layered on top of the lingering debts from emancipation. There is military conscription, capable of swallowing a family's strongest sons for years at a stretch. There is a landlord, quite possibly you, or a family very much like yours, whose comfortable life is built directly on top of their labor, and whom they encounter, if they encounter him at all, as a distant figure passing by in a fine carriage on his way towards somewhere better. To them, you are barely a person either. You are more like the weather, a force that takes and offers nothing edible in return. And yet you have constructed an entire comforting mythology to make peace with all of this. You tell yourself the peasant is a simple, devout creature, mystically attached to both the soil and to the Tsar, whom he supposedly loves as a kind of distant father figure. There is a small grain of genuine truth buried inside that story, and a mountain of self-serving fantasy piled directly on top of it. It is, after all, far easier to enjoy your caviar in peace if you believe the people who caught the fish are simple, happy souls who desire nothing more than to serve you. The alternative, that they might be intelligent, furious, and entirely capable of arithmetic, would ruin the meal completely, because they are, in fact, doing the arithmetic. Word travels, even into the smallest villages. News of the wider world, of other countries, of new and dangerous ideas, filters in through returning soldiers, through the small number who can read, through organizers who make it their business to explain to a hungry man precisely why he remains hungry. The peasant is beginning, slowly and unmistakably, to understand that his poverty is not simply the natural order of the universe. It is a system, built by particular people, for particular reasons, and systems, unlike weather, can be dismantled by the very people trapped inside them, especially when those people outnumber the ones at the top by a margin too large to comfortably imagine. None of this reaches you, of course. From where you sit, the countryside appears calm, the fields look full, the villages seem quiet, and the folk songs, if you ever paused long enough to actually hear one, would sound perfectly, harmlessly content. So you turn away from the frosted window and back toward the warmth and candlelight of the room behind you, because there is, as always in your world, a party to prepare for. And preparing for parties, as you are about to discover in considerably more detail, is very nearly a full-time occupation in itself. Your calendar carries no trace of ordinary work, because you have never performed any, and so it organizes itself instead around something far more demanding: the social season. This is a marathon stretching across balls, formal dinners, receptions, and evenings at the opera where the actual music playing on stage is almost entirely beside the point. The true performance happens in the audience, in who is seated where, who arrived with whom who is wearing this season's fashion and who has embarrassingly clung to last year's. Missing an important invitation is treated as a minor catastrophe. Being seated even slightly below someone you consider beneath you is a wound that can smart for weeks. It is genuinely remarkable how much emotional energy your entire class pours into problems that, from any sane distance, do not actually exist, all while carefully avoiding the one enormous problem that very much does. But we will come to that. For now, put on your finest shoes because the season has a rhythm, and everyone who matters follows it as faithfully as a migrating flock follows the weather. In the coldest, darkest stretch of winter, the great families converge on the capital, and the city transforms into a blur of lit windows and carriages hissing softly through the snow. Balls unfold nearly every night at one grand house or another. Formal dinners stretch on for hours, moving through enough courses that a guest must genuinely pace themselves, the way an athlete might pace a long race. There is the theater, the ballet, the opera, where your family occupies its designated box and spends most of the performance quietly cataloging which other boxes are occupied, by whom, in what company, wearing what. The stage is merely the pretext. The audience is the actual show, and keeping up with it all is, somehow, exhausting, a fact that outsiders to this world rarely believe, since doing nothing of substance is somehow still a job with punishing hours. You are expected to appear at precisely the right events and to skillfully avoid the wrong ones. You are expected to hold, effortlessly, the entire tangled map of who currently feuds with whom, whose fortunes are rising, whose family has quietly gone bankrupt while still pretending otherwise, which marriage is being carefully arranged behind closed doors, and which one is silently falling apart in plain sight. Your conversation must be light without becoming careless, charming without tipping into warmth, because sincerity is considered a small social crime, and genuine emotion is something best reserved for the servants' hall. It resembles, in a strange way, a game with 1,000 invisible rules, where the only prize on offer is the privilege of continuing to play. The stakes feel enormous because, within the small and airless confines of your world, they genuinely are. Your family's entire social position rests on a delicate scaffolding of appearances and alliances, and one careless misstep can send the whole structure trembling. Snub the wrong person, and doors that once opened easily begin, quietly, to close. Allow yourself to be snubbed, and the whispering begins almost immediately, and whispering, in this particular world, has ended families as thoroughly and as permanently as any bankruptcy ever could. So you pour your considerable intelligence, your cunning, your restless energy into navigating a set of hazards that would strike any outside observer as entirely invented. And that, in the end, is the great comedy hiding inside the social season. It is a magnificent, ruthless, glittering competition over essentially nothing at all. Not one triumph achieved in these ballrooms will feed a single hungry family, repair a single road, or strengthen the empire by so much as an inch. It is pure status, layered on pure status, an entire ruling class devoting its finest hours to the delicate mathematics of who curtsies first to whom. And while all of that brilliant energy burns itself up on seating arrangements and perfectly timed eyebrows, the real country, the enormous, unglamorous one existing just beyond the ballroom doors, drifts steadily toward a cliff that nobody in the room has thought to look for. You cannot see the cliff from inside the ballroom, of course. From in here, all you can see is candlelight. And tonight, quite a lot of it is lit, because tonight there is a ball, and a ball, as you are about to discover, is not really a party at all. It is closer to an examination, and failing it can prove very nearly fatal to a family standing. There are, by conservative estimate, thousands of unwritten rules governing this single evening, and every person in the room seems to know every one of them except, somehow, you. You must bow to precisely the correct depth, to precisely the correct person, calibrated according to a hierarchy of rank so intricate it would make a modern corporate org chart look almost restful by comparison. You must dance the mazurka without injuring your partner. You must make conversation that reveals nothing true about yourself. And you must, under absolutely no circumstances, laugh at the wrong moment. The chandeliers overhead burn with hundreds of candles. The jewels scattered across the room could ransom a mid-sized city outright. And somewhere in the middle of all that shimmering noise, someone is quietly deciding your family's entire social future based on nothing more than how gracefully you hold a fork. Let us walk in together. The ballroom itself is a genuine vision, and it is built to be exactly that. Candlelight multiplies endlessly across the tall gilt mirrors lining the walls until the whole space seems constructed entirely out of light. The floor gleams, polished to a dangerous, mirror-like shine. Somewhere the orchestra tunes its instruments. The air hangs thick with perfume, hot candle wax, and the particular electric tension of several hundred people simultaneously performing effortless ease. Every person present is beautifully dressed, armored in silk and diamonds, and every person present is also, quietly, watching everyone else with the sharp, practiced attention of people who long ago turned social surveillance into a leisure activity. Then, the dancing begins, and this is not the loose, informal swaying of a modern gathering. These are formal, memorized sequences, elaborate patterns of steps and turns and partner changes that everyone in this room learned as small children under the watchful, unforgiving eye of a professional dancing master. To stumble here is to be noticed. To forget a figure mid-sequence is to be quietly humiliated in front of precisely the people whose good opinion determines your family's worth for the coming year. The mazurka in particular is spirited and genuinely difficult, and a young man who performs it beautifully earns real, lasting admiration, while one who performs it badly might as well announce his family's decline through a trumpet. Your feet, in other words, are not simply dancing tonight. They are testifying in real time to your fitness for continued membership in this world. Then there is the conversation, which is its own dance entirely, and arguably the far more dangerous one. You must remain light without straying into shallow, amusing without becoming clever in a way that threatens anyone, flirtatious within precise and entirely unspoken boundaries. You must compliment freely without appearing to grovel, gossip skillfully without ever being caught doing it, and steer well clear of anything genuinely real, politics, money, sincere emotion, the actual state of the country outside these walls. These are simply not acceptable topics, and a guest earnest enough to raise them at a ball is regarded roughly the way a modern gathering might regard someone who suddenly burst into tears at a dinner party. The entire art form here is staying beautifully, permanently on the surface of things. Rank governs every last detail of the evening. A precise, exhaustively detailed order of precedence determines who is greeted first, who sits where, who may approach whom, and in exactly what manner. A grand duchess outranks a countess, who outranks a mere untitled gentleman's wife, and mistaking that order, or worse, treating unequal ranks as though they were somehow equal, is precisely the sort of error that follows a family for years afterward. You spend the entire evening performing constant, invisible mathematics, calculating rank, adjusting the depth of your bow, measuring exactly how much warmth is appropriate for each greeting, all while also dancing, also conversing, also trying very hard not to visibly perspire through an extremely expensive gown. Survive the whole evening intact, and you have gained nothing more than the right to do it all again next week. Fail it, truly fail it, and the consequences can ripple outward for years. This is the strange, layered truth sitting at the heart of every ball you will ever attend. It is the most beautiful room you may ever stand inside, and it is also, quietly, a trap. A glittering, candle-lit trap in which your family's entire future is wagered, night after night, on nothing more substantial than the placement of your feet and the timing of your smile. And if all of this already sounds intimidating, brace yourself, because there exists a version of this evening that is grander still, stricter still, and considerably more perilous. There is the Imperial court. If your family is truly of the highest rank, you may one day be formally presented at court, the aristocratic equivalent of a final examination with no possibility of a retake. This means an audience within physical reach of the Tsar and Tsarina themselves, inside halls so heavily gilded they seem almost to be quietly on fire, surrounded by courtiers who have spent entire lifetimes perfecting the art of standing perfectly still while silently judging everyone who enters. The rules of court etiquette are so elaborate that people study them the way a surgeon studies anatomy, methodically, exhaustively, because a single misplaced word or gesture can take years to recover from. Proximity to the throne is the single greatest prize your world recognizes. It is also, though nobody present would ever say so aloud, quietly becoming the most dangerous address in the entire empire. The setting itself is designed to overwhelm, and it succeeds completely. The imperial palaces make even your own grand home look, by comparison, like a modest country cottage. There are halls finished in malachite and gold, floors of inlaid wood so fine you feel almost guilty walking across them, and enough gilding on the walls that on a bright day the light bouncing off them becomes nearly painful to the eye. Every proportion in the building is scaled to make an individual human being feel small, and the throne itself feel eternal. You process through these rooms in formal court dress, governed by its own rigid regulations down to the precise fabric and the exact length of your train, acutely aware that everyone present has already assessed your outfit, your posture, and your family's entire reputation within roughly 4 seconds of your arrival. The etiquette here is simultaneously a science and a minefield. There are exact, memorized rules for how deeply to bow or curtsy depending on rank, how to approach the imperial presence, when to speak, and when to remain silent, and how to withdraw afterward without committing the singular catastrophe of turning your back on the throne. Young women presented at court must master a curtsy so deep and so tightly controlled that it borders on genuine athletic achievement, all while wearing a heavy formal gown and being observed by the single most critical audience the empire has to offer. You have rehearsed this moment for weeks beforehand. You are still, quite reasonably, terrified, because the court possesses a very long memory and remarkably little mercy for a fumble. At the center of it all sit the Tsar and Tsarina, the living summit of your entire social universe. To be noticed favorably by them is the highest achievement your world recognizes, an honor that can echo through a family's reputation for generations afterward. To be received coldly is a genuine wound, one that can quietly damage careers, marriages, and futures for years to come. And so the court hums constantly with ambition, flattery, rivalry, and carefully hidden fear, all of it concealed behind flawless manners and perfectly composed smiles. It is at once the most refined room in the empire and one of its most quietly vicious. You want this, of course. Everything in your entire upbringing has pointed you toward that throne like a compass needle fixed permanently toward true north. Proximity to the crown is the whole of the game, the summit you have spent your life climbing without ever quite pausing to ask yourself why. To stand near the Tsar is to stand inside the warm light of legitimacy itself, the very source from which your entire world draws its meaning. There is, in your understanding of things, no higher place to occupy. Which is exactly why you ought to be afraid, though at present you are not, because almost nobody standing in these dazzling rooms tonight is thinking about the future in the way the future is already thinking about them. The closer you stand to that throne, the higher you have climbed, and the higher you have climbed, the further, one day, there will be to fall. When this entire gilded structure eventually comes down, and the support beams are already groaning quietly if you knew how to listen for it, it will not fall gently, and it will not fall first on the people standing at the bottom. It will fall first on the people closest to the crown, the ones who wanted this particular proximity most desperately of all. But that particular reckoning is still a few years away. For tonight, you curtsy, you rise. And you bask contentedly in the warmth. There remains, after all, so much more of this glittering life left to explore, beginning with the question of marriage, which in your world is treated as far too important a matter to be left to anything so unreliable as love. In your class, marriage is treated less like a matter of the heart and more like a merger between two treasuries, dressed up afterward in lace and orange blossom. It is a fusion of fortunes, family names, and long-term strategy, negotiated by relatives who regard your future happiness as, at best, a pleasant side effect. A well-arranged match can rescue a struggling estate from ruin. A poorly arranged one can quietly sink a dynasty within a generation. You might meet your future spouse only a handful of times before the wedding itself, always under such thorough supervision that a genuinely private conversation is nearly impossible to arrange. Affection, if it comes at all, is expected to arrive sometime after the ceremony, a delayed delivery, so to speak. It is a strange foundation on which to build an entire life, and it frequently means sharing a very large, very cold house with someone who remains, in most practical respects, a stranger. Consider how carefully the whole arrangement gets assembled. Somewhere in a quiet drawing room, older relatives are surveying the field of eligible families the way a general studies a battlefield map, weighing bloodlines, titles, and, above everything else, money. Does the other family hold land that complements yours? Do their debts cancel out against your own, or do they simply double the burden? Is their name old enough, distinguished enough, sufficiently well-connected at court? You, the actual living person meant to occupy the center of this arrangement, are consulted about as often as the drawing room furniture is consulted about where it ought to be placed. Your preferences are treated as a pleasant bonus if they happen to align neatly with the family strategy, and as a minor inconvenience to be quietly managed if they do not. Whatever courtship exists unfolds under near constant supervision. A young woman of your class is guarded as carefully as a locked vault. She is rarely, if ever, left alone with a man, and every meeting with a prospective husband takes place beneath the watchful eye of a mother, an aunt, or a chaperone whose entire function is to ensure that nothing remotely interesting occurs. A few careful words might be exchanged at a ball, a few more across a formal dinner table, and on the strength of these brief, heavily supervised encounters, you are expected to commit the remainder of your life to a person you know, in practical terms, about as well as you know your own physician. And yet the stakes could scarcely be higher, because in this world marriage is essentially permanent and essentially total. Divorce carries a scandal so severe that most families would sooner endure decades of quiet, private misery than risk it. So the match you make in your 20s is very often the match you keep until death, for better, and quite frequently for considerably worse. If fortune favors you, respect grows over the years, then companionship, and sometimes even a genuine, if late-blooming, form of love. If it does not, you spend your life politely orbiting a near stranger, each of you quietly conducting your real emotional life elsewhere while maintaining, in public, a flawless performance of marital unity, because that performance is, in the end, the entire point of the arrangement. A great marriage in your world is not measured by the private happiness of the two people living inside it. It is measured by what it produces: heirs to continue the family line, useful alliances to strengthen its standing, and the seamless public appearance of a dynasty functioning exactly as a dynasty is meant to function. Love is considered a private matter, and frankly, a slightly embarrassing one to discuss openly. Duty is the public virtue you were raised from birth to prize above nearly everything else. So you enter marriage the way you have entered everything else in this life, dressed magnificently, watched closely by everyone who matters, and following a script that was written by other people long before you were born. It may, in time, bring you real contentment. It may bring you a quiet, well-dressed loneliness. Either way, it will very likely bring you children, which raises the next great question hanging over your gilded existence. What exactly happens to those children, given how little you will actually be permitted to raise them yourself? Being a wealthy woman in the Russian Empire is a peculiar sort of confinement, one so thoroughly upholstered in silk and diamonds that you may go years without fully noticing the bars. Your value in this society is measured chiefly by your family name, the size of your dowry, your ability to produce healthy heirs, and your skill at presiding gracefully over a large and demanding household. Formal power is, technically speaking, forbidden to you outright. So you learn instead to exercise power sideways through influence, through carefully cultivated connections, through the quiet architecture of who receives an invitation and who does not. You are educated just enough to be charming company, and deliberately not educated enough to ever be considered dangerous. And yet, tucked inside this restricted existence, a great many women grow remarkably sharp, watchful, and formidable, quietly running enormous estates and complicated extended families with a level of competence the men around them rarely bother to notice, let alone credit. Let us be honest about the confinement first, because it is entirely real. Your life is bounded on every side by rules you had no hand in writing. You cannot vote. You cannot hold most formal positions of authority. You cannot move through the world with anything resembling the freedom your brothers take entirely for granted. Your reputation is a fragile, precious thing, easily shattered by even a false rumor, and so your movements are watched, your friendships carefully managed, your every behavior measured against a standard of grace that borders on the impossible. A man of your class can gamble recklessly, drink heavily, and stray from his marriage, and society will, at most, offer a mild shrug. A woman who does even a fraction of the same is finished, socially, for good. The rules are not equal, and everyone in the room knows perfectly well that they are not equal, and everyone just as thoroughly pretends this is simply the natural order of things. But here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because a clever woman confined to a cage rarely just sits inside it quietly. She learns the shape of the bars with great precision, and then she learns patiently to work in the spaces between them. Denied formal authority outright, the women of your class became masters of its informal cousin. Unable to command, you learn to influence. Unable to manage an estate on paper, you frequently run it in practice while your husband is occupied elsewhere, drinking, gambling, or chasing some new distraction. Unable to sit in the halls of government, you can nonetheless host the very salon where the men who do sit there come to talk freely, and you can shape those conversations with a skill they scarcely ever notice they are being managed by. The great households of the empire, in truth, very often run on quiet female competence. Behind the grand public facade of male authority, it is frequently the lady of the house who keeps the entire enterprise from slowly collapsing. Managing a large domestic staff, the family's finances, an endlessly demanding social calendar, the children's education, and the delicate, constantly shifting web of extended family relationships, all while maintaining the serene public appearance of a woman who does nothing whatsoever but look decorative. It amounts to an enormous quantity of invisible labor, performed by people given no official credit for any of it. A story, unfortunately, considerably older than the Russian Empire itself. And so you become something the men around you rarely take the time to see clearly: shrewd, resilient, and quietly formidable, an operator of real and considerable skill who has spent her entire life being carefully trained to conceal exactly how much power she actually holds. Some women find genuine satisfaction inside this arrangement. Others find only a beautifully upholstered frustration that never quite lifts. Most experience some exhausting combination of both. But whatever inner strength any given woman develops, it exists entirely within limits she cannot escape. And one of the sharpest of those limits is the uncomfortable fact that even her own children are not, in any meaningful day-to-day sense, entirely hers to raise. Your children, whatever affection you hold for them, are largely raised by other people. Nursemaids handle the earliest years. Then come governesses and tutors, frequently imported from France, England, or Germany, so that your children grow up fluent in 3 languages and comparatively unfamiliar with the country they will one day inherit and presumably help govern. You see them at scheduled, appointed times, scrubbed, presentable and briefly displayed before being whisked away again to the nursery wing, which functions, in practical terms, as an entirely separate household within your own. It is affection conducted at a formal, managed distance, love delivered, essentially, by appointment. Your own child may well grow closer to an English nanny than to you, and in a twist of fate you cannot yet foresee, some of those cultured foreign tutors are quietly planting, in young and impressionable minds, the very ideas that will one day help bring this entire world crashing down. Picture the physical arrangement clearly. The children do not truly live with you, not in any meaningful sense. They occupy the nursery wing, a small, self-contained kingdom at the far end of the house, staffed by nannies and nursemaids who feed them, bathe them, comfort them through the night, and are present for the 10,000 small, ordinary moments that actually constitute a childhood. You, by contrast, are present chiefly for the highlights, the arranged visits, the brief windows in which a clean, well-behaved child is brought downstairs to be admired for a few pleasant minutes, and then removed again before anything as tiresome as a genuine tantrum has the chance to occur. You love these children enormously, and you know them in truth, rather less thoroughly than the household staff does. The earliest emotional bonds, unsurprisingly, tend to form not with you but with the nurse, that warm, constant, ever-present figure, who is actually there through the long nights and the small daily crises. A great many aristocrats, looking back later in life, remembered their childhood nurse with considerably more genuine warmth than they remembered their own mother, simply because the nurse was the one who was consistently, physically present. It is, viewed plainly, a strange arrangement, outsourcing the deepest and most formative years of your child's emotional life to a hired stranger, but it is simply how things have always been done in your world, and questioning it feels a little like questioning the weather. As the children grow, the foreign tutors arrive in earnest. A French governess to instill manners and, above all, fluent French. Perhaps an English tutor, since English customs and English schooling carry a certain fashionable prestige. A German instructor, often, for music or discipline. Your children grow up trilingual, refined, thoroughly cosmopolitan, more comfortable discussing European art and philosophy than the realities of the vast, largely unseen Russian countryside stretching out beyond the estate's front gates. They are, in effect, being carefully manufactured into perfect little aristocrats, polished and prepared for a world everyone around them assumes will simply last forever. And here sits the exquisite irony you cannot possibly see coming yet. These educated foreigners you have personally welcomed into the heart of your own home, these clever tutors and governesses quietly shaping your children's minds, also happen to be conduits for the wider currents of modern thought. And modern thought, in this particular era, is crackling with ideas that are extremely dangerous to families exactly like yours. A tutor with liberal sympathies. A governess who quietly lends an older child a forbidden book. A cheaply hired mathematics instructor who happens to hold very firm private opinions about the redistribution of property. You have opened your front door to the modern mind, and the modern mind, as it turns out, does not think a great deal of hereditary privilege. So the next generation of your family is being raised by strangers, in 3 foreign languages, absorbing along with their grammar lessons the faint, early tremors of the earthquake still to come. They are being prepared, thoroughly and expensively, for a life that is quietly, invisibly already being canceled behind their backs. That preparation deserves a closer look, because the education of an aristocrat in this era is a masterpiece of a very particular, and, as it will turn out, ultimately fatal kind of uselessness. You can quote poetry fluently in 4 languages. You can discuss French philosophy with real confidence. You play the piano competently, ride elegantly, and can identify a fine vintage from 50 paces. What you cannot do, notably, is anything remotely practical. You have never cooked a single meal. You have never lit your own fire, handled your own household accounts, or spent an afternoon doing anything that would still matter if every servant in the building simply vanished overnight. Your entire education is ornamental by design, built to produce a delightful dinner guest and a graceful social ornament rather than a genuinely functioning adult. It is, in its way, rather like being trained your whole life for a job that consists entirely of attending parties, which, to be fair, is more or less the actual job description, right up until the exact moment the parties stop altogether. Let us admire the curriculum for a moment, because it is genuinely impressive on its own narrow terms. You have been taught languages until they pour effortlessly from you, French above all, but also English, German, occasionally Italian. You know literature deeply enough to drop a perfectly chosen quotation into conversation at exactly the right moment. You have studied music and can perform respectably at the piano whenever called upon. You dance beautifully. You ride beautifully. You understand art, history, and the exact, dizzying gradations of rank that govern your entire social world down to the smallest detail. By the standards of your class, you are superbly, comprehensively accomplished. And every single one of these accomplishments is, on close inspection, purely decorative. Nothing you were taught was ever meant to produce anything of practical value. You were not educated to build, to make, to solve problems, to earn a living, or to survive hardship. You were educated to decorate a drawing room, to serve as an asset to your family's social standing, to marry well, to converse charmingly, and to glide through the world like a lovely, expensive object that also happens to be capable of discussing philosophy. Usefulness in the ordinary sense was never remotely the goal. Usefulness in your world was strictly for other people, the ones who grew the food, tended the fires, and quietly made your entire floating existence possible in the first place. There are, as a result, gaps in your practical knowledge so wide you are not even fully aware they exist, because they have simply never once mattered. You cannot cook, having only ever entered a kitchen to briefly inspect it. You do not really understand how money works beyond the fact that it appears, is spent by stewards and managers on your behalf, and somehow never quite runs out. You could not light a stove, mend a torn garment, grow a vegetable, or complete any of the countless small survival tasks the overwhelming majority of humanity performs every single day without a second thought. If you were dropped tomorrow into an ordinary working life, you would likely prove about as capable as a well-read child. For the moment, this is not remotely a problem. It is, in fact, the entire point. Your uselessness functions as a status symbol, living proof that you stand so comfortably far above the grubby daily necessities of life that you have simply never had to learn them. The truly grand person, in your world's peculiar logic, does not know how things actually work, because knowing how things work is faintly beneath their dignity. Helplessness, in short, is a luxury item, and you wear it as proudly as any fur coat in your extensive wardrobe. But hold that particular thought tightly, because there is a version of the near future rushing toward you in which the servants are gone, the family fortune has evaporated, the estates have been seized outright, and the single most valuable skill on the entire planet has quietly become the ability to do something, anything at all, with your own two soft, carefully idle hands. In that coming world, every language you speak, every poem you can recite, every perfectly executed curtsy will be worth precisely nothing, and the peasant who knows how to grow a potato will suddenly be richer than you in every way that has come to matter. You cannot yet imagine that particular future. So instead, this afternoon, you go shopping, because if your expensive education prepared you for exactly one thing with real precision, it is spending money with genuine practice style. Your class has elevated the act of spending into something bordering on religious devotion. There are jewels sewn directly into the seams of gowns, entire rooms in the house decorated and furnished for use exactly once a year, and objects of such exquisite, deliberate pointlessness that they take the breath away. The Imperial family itself commissions extraordinary jeweled eggs each Easter, small, dazzling masterpieces of gold, enamel, and precious stones, each one containing some hidden mechanical surprise, each one worth a sum that could genuinely reshape the fortunes of an entire province. Owning beautiful things in your world is never quite enough on its own. The things must be needlessly, almost defiantly expensive because the expense itself is the actual message being sent. You are announcing, in diamonds, that your family has grown so wealthy that money itself has essentially stopped feeling real. Somewhere in a cold, distant village, of course, that same money remains extremely real indeed, and that precise gap between the two is exactly where revolutions eventually come from. Consider those famous eggs for a moment, because they capture the whole enterprise perfectly. Each spring, the Imperial family receives a new jeweled egg from the court's most celebrated jeweler. And these are not really decorations so much as small miracles of obsessive craftsmanship. Gold and enamel and precious stone, concealing inside a tiny mechanical bird that sings, or a miniature carriage that genuinely rolls, or a portrait nested cleverly within a jewel. Each one takes roughly a year of dedicated labor to complete, and each one costs a sum that could, quite literally, feed and house a substantial number of the empire's hungry for that entire year. They are, without question, exquisite. They are also, viewed honestly for even a moment, among the most concentrated expressions of moral blindness a human hand has ever crafted. And the eggs are only the most famous peak of a habit running through your entire class, top to bottom. Everything about your daily life is, in one form or another, an exercise in conspicuous excess. There are ropes of pearls and rivers of diamonds worn casually to an ordinary dinner, gowns embroidered by hand across months of skilled labor and worn, perhaps, twice in a lifetime. Grand ballrooms opened for a single evening each year and heated, at enormous cost, for that one occasion alone. Furs, private carriages, imported delicacies, entire art collections assembled less out of genuine love than out of the simple institutional need to possess an art collection. You do not purchase things because you require them. You purchase them because the purchase itself proves precisely what your family is. That distinction is worth sitting with, because it is the crucial one. The expense here is not an unfortunate side effect of luxury. The expense is the entire purpose of the exercise. A reasonably priced object, however lovely, communicates essentially nothing about your family's standing. An absurdly, almost insultingly expensive object communicates everything at once. That your family sits so comfortably above ordinary financial concerns that money has become, for you, a kind of abstraction, something deployed purely for effect rather than carefully counted for survival. To spend wildly is to demonstrate, publicly and unmistakably, that you can. And demonstrating that you can spend without limit is, in the end, the closest thing your entire class possesses to a genuine sense of purpose. Step back, though, and examine the underlying arithmetic, the arithmetic you have been so carefully trained, your entire life, never to look at directly. Every diamond, every jeweled egg, every ballroom lit for a single glittering evening represents an enormous quantity of accumulated value, and every bit of that value came from somewhere specific. It came up out of the land and out of the labor of the people who work it, out of grain, out of timber, out of the endless, unglamorous effort of millions of people you will never meet. It was gathered patiently from across an entire country and concentrated here, in this one room, into objects whose sole function is to glitter and quietly announce your family's superiority. Now imagine, for just a moment, that you are one of the people whose labor actually produced that wealth, standing out in the cold, genuinely hungry, catching sight of the golden bird, or simply hearing about it secondhand from someone who has. Imagine being told, by someone persuasive enough, precisely how many of your own winters were quietly absorbed into the making of that single glittering toy. This is the exact gap that eventually swallows empires whole. This is the precise distance, measured out in diamonds, between the very top of your world and the very bottom of it. And it is a distance an increasing number of people are beginning to find entirely, permanently unforgivable. But you cannot dwell on unpleasant thoughts of that kind for very long, because you are, at the moment, feeling somewhat unwell. And when you feel unwell, your class has developed a very particular and very expensive solution to the problem. When you fall ill in your world, You do not simply summon a doctor and rest in bed. You embark, instead, on what might generously be called a health journey, ideally to somewhere warm, fashionable, and expensive, preferably somewhere with a French name attached to it. Your class treats sickness less as a medical emergency and more as an occasion for travel, decamping to spa towns and seaside resorts to take the waters, calm the nerves, and slowly recover from the exhausting business of doing essentially nothing. Nervous complaints, in particular, function almost as a hobby among people of your standing. A delicate constitution carries real social prestige. Meanwhile, actual medicine remains a curious blend of genuine expertise, expensive guesswork, and whatever remedy happens to be fashionable among specialists this particular season. You will very likely be bled, dosed, massaged, and sent off to breathe mountain air at some point in your life. And when your own child falls seriously, frighteningly ill in a way ordinary doctors cannot touch, your class has developed an alarming tendency to turn toward something considerably stranger for help. The spa cure sits at the very center of aristocratic medicine, and it is, in its own way, a genuine marvel of turning illness into an extended holiday. Feeling run-down, nervous, vaguely unwell in the particular manner common among people with nothing pressing to occupy their time. The prescription, almost without exception, is a lengthy stay at a fashionable European spa, where you will drink mineral water of questionable therapeutic value, soak in warm baths, take gentle supervised walks, and above all, be seen taking the cure in the company of everyone else who happens to matter that season. Half the therapeutic benefit is genuinely medical. The other half is thoroughly social, since the great spa towns of Europe function in practice as the summer social season simply relocated to prettier scenery. You travel there to get well, and you travel there to be seen getting well, and it is not entirely clear which of the two purposes actually matters more to you. Nervous complaints, specifically, carry a curious kind of prestige in your world. To possess delicate nerves, a sensitive constitution, a fashionable tendency toward exhaustion, is considered refined, even faintly glamorous. A hardworking peasant, after all, never suffers from nervous complaints, simply because a hardworking peasant is far too occupied with the basic business of not starving. Your own fragility, by contrast, functions as a kind of luxury good, quiet proof that you are simply too finely made for the coarse demands of ordinary existence. A great deal of aristocratic illness, if examined honestly, hovers somewhere in the ambiguous space between genuine suffering and carefully performed delicacy, treated with rest cures and mountain air, and the attentive, well-paid care of physicians who know far better than to tell a paying patient that nothing much is actually wrong with them. The medicine of this era is, in truth, a genuine mixture of real progress and confident nonsense delivered with excellent bedside manner. There are real advances, skilled and thoughtful doctors, and there is also a considerable amount of expensive guesswork dressed up in scientific-sounding language. You may find yourself bled, purged, dosed with tonics of dubious composition, or prescribed elaborate regimens built on theories that will look faintly absurd within a single generation. Money buys you access to the very best care available, and that care is, depending entirely on the day and the doctor, sometimes genuinely excellent and sometimes elaborately useless. And you, lacking any real medical training yourself, have no reliable way of telling the two apart, since the useless variety is delivered with precisely as much confident authority as the good. There is, however, one particular shadow that no amount of family money can lift, and it falls, quite unexpectedly, across the very highest household in the entire land. When a child of your class suffers from something the finest doctors in Europe simply cannot cure, a mysterious, terrifying, seemingly incurable affliction, genuine desperation sets in. And desperation has a way of making even the most sophisticated people reach for anything at all that offers even a flicker of hope. The greatest physicians available stand helpless. The most respected medical minds in the empire simply shrug. And into that particular gap, The space where science has failed and a mother's raw fear takes hold completely, steps a figure who offers precisely what the doctors cannot: the appearance, however fragile, of a miracle. That figure is about to become one of the single most notorious men in your empire's entire history, and his quiet presence near the throne is a symptom of something far deeper and far more troubling than anything a fashionable spa town could ever hope to treat. But before meeting him properly, let us first follow your class as it moves, restless and endlessly comfortable, across the wider map of Europe. Because travel is the other great occupation of the idle rich, and it reveals with real clarity just how little of your own vast country you have actually ever bothered to see. You travel constantly, and always in considerable comfort, gliding across the continent in private railway carriages fitted out like small, mobile hotels, taking the grand tour, wintering along the French Riviera, summering wherever the fashionable set has decided to gather that particular year. Europe functions as your personal playground, and you move through it inside a bubble of luxury so complete that you rarely have to touch the actual world lying just outside the glass. When you cross your own enormous country by train, you watch it scroll silently past the window like a painting of somewhere else entirely. Endless forests, frozen rivers, poor scattered villages that seem to belong to a wholly different century. You are, in every practical sense, a tourist inside your own empire. You know the boulevards of Paris more intimately than you know the province your family fortune actually comes from. And that comfortable, insulating distance is about to become considerably harder to maintain than you currently imagine. The private railway carriage is, in many ways, the perfect symbol of how you move through the world. It is not merely transport. It is a rolling extension of your palace itself, fitted with beds, a private dining area, attentive servants, and every comfort carefully sealed off from the actual country sliding past the windows. You board in one grand city and disembark, refreshed, in another entirely, existing in between inside a small, padded world of your own, insulated completely from the enormous nation passing silently by outside the glass. You could cross 1,000 miles of Russian countryside and never once breathe its open air or exchange a single word with a soul who actually lives there. You simply arrive, refreshed and unbothered, wherever the fashionable people happen to be gathering that particular season. Those gatherings tend, overwhelmingly, to happen in the West. The French Riviera in winter, its promenades crowded with Russian aristocrats fleeing the cold back home. The great European spa towns during their own particular season. Paris, always and endlessly Paris, for the clothing, the culture, the sheer pleasure of standing somewhere that considers itself, without irony, the true center of civilization. Your class feels, if anything, more genuinely at home in these Western playgrounds than in the depths of its own country. You speak the language fluently. You know the shops by name. You encounter the same familiar faces season after season. Russia, in this arrangement, is simply where your money originates. Europe is where you travel to actually enjoy it. This means, inevitably, that your working knowledge of your own vast empire remains astonishingly thin. You know the capital reasonably well. You know your family's particular estate, and you know the well-worn route connecting it to the border. The rest of it, the overwhelming majority of the largest country on Earth, remains little more than a rumor to you, a landscape briefly glimpsed through a train window, populated by people you have quietly come to regard as belonging to an altogether different order of existence. You could navigate the boulevards of Paris blindfolded, and could not reliably find your way through the province that funds your entire way of life. You are, in the truest sense, a foreigner in your own homeland and a regular abroad, a strange condition indeed for someone who is, at least in theory, supposed to be a pillar of the nation. When you do occasionally glance out through the train window at your own country passing by, what you see tends only to confirm every comfortable assumption you already hold. The villages appear poor, backward, quaint, even faintly picturesque, scenery rather than a place genuinely full of thinking, feeling, increasingly restless human beings. You register scenery, not individuals. The poverty visible outside the glass reads, if it registers at all, as some kind of natural feature of the landscape, no different in your mind from the forests or the rivers, rather than a condition actively created and maintained by the very system that keeps you comfortably seated inside this particular private railway carriage. But bubbles of this kind possess a curious quality. They feel entirely permanent from the inside, and they are, in reality, always remarkably fragile. The careful distance you have spent a lifetime maintaining, this lovely, deliberate insulation separating your world from the real one just outside, depends entirely on that real world remaining quiet and staying reliably in its place. It will not. The country you have spent your whole life observing safely through glass is, before very long, going to come crashing directly through the window, and no private railway carriage, however luxuriously appointed, will carry you away quickly enough to escape it. For the moment, though, the bubble holds firm, sustained by perhaps the deepest and most soothing force in your entire civilization, the quiet, constant presence of religious faith, which reassures everyone, from the humblest peasant to the grandest noble, that the whole existing arrangement was ordained, personally and directly, by God. Faith runs through your world like a thread of gold. The Orthodox Church is genuinely everywhere, glowing softly in the icon lamp burning in the corner of every room, drifting through the incense and candlelight of long, beautiful services, structuring the entire calendar around an unbroken cycle of fasts and feasts. For a great many people, this faith is entirely sincere. For many others, it has become closer to comfortable habit, a reliable source of order, and a reassuring belief that the whole hierarchy, running from the humblest peasant up to the Tsar himself, was arranged personally by God, and is therefore not a fit subject for questioning. It is, unsurprisingly, an especially soothing idea if you happen to occupy a comfortable position somewhere near the top of that hierarchy. But the empire is quietly filling up with new ideas, hungry, modern, distinctly godless ideas, suggesting that the entire hierarchy was not arranged by God at all, but by ordinary people, and that ordinary people remain entirely free to rearrange it whenever they eventually choose to. The presence of the church in your daily life is total, and it is undeniably beautiful. In a high corner of nearly every room in your home hangs an icon, a sacred image of Christ, or the Virgin, or a favored saint, often gilded, often genuinely ancient, with a small lamp kept perpetually burning before it. You cross yourself automatically upon entering or leaving a room. The entire rhythm of your year is set by the church calendar, the great feasts, the long solemn stretches of fasting, the extended meatless weeks of Lent, and finally the overwhelming glory of Easter, which in the Orthodox tradition ranks as the single most magnificent celebration of the entire year. The services themselves run long, sung rather than simply spoken, thick with incense and candlelight and the deep, resonant sound of a trained choir. And whatever your private beliefs happen to be, the experience is, by any measure, genuinely beautiful. For a great many people, this faith is entirely sincere, a real and steady anchor through a difficult world. For others, it functions closer to inherited habit, a set of familiar forms observed simply because they have always been observed, and because doing otherwise feels quietly unthinkable. But sincere or habitual, the church performs one particular function for your class that is worth naming plainly. It teaches that the entire social order, with the Tsar seated firmly at the top, the peasantry at the bottom, and your own comfortable self settled somewhere near the summit, is not an accident, not an injustice, not something human beings constructed and could therefore choose to dismantle, but rather the direct, sacred will of God. This is, if you happen to occupy a position near the top of that order, an extraordinarily convenient thing to believe. It transforms your privilege from something that might one day require justification into something openly holy. You are not wealthy because your ancestors seized land and bound human beings to it by law. You are wealthy because that is, quite simply, the station God personally assigned to you. And the peasant remains poor because that, in turn, is the station God assigned to him. To question this particular arrangement is treated not merely as impolite, but as something bordering on outright blasphemy. The church blesses the entire structure and wraps it gently in incense, and for centuries this arrangement has helped keep the enormous base of the social pyramid patient, prayerful, and firmly in place. But something is shifting now, quietly in the wider air of the empire, and the church's long, powerful spell is beginning, at its edges, to weaken. New ideas are moving steadily through the country, carried by students, by factory workers, by determined organizers, and these particular ideas are frankly hostile to the entire notion of a divinely ordered hierarchy. They insist that the arrangement is not the will of God at all, but simply the work of men, that poverty is not sacred, but manufactured, that the whole pyramid could, in principle, be knocked flat and rebuilt from scratch on entirely different terms. To a hungry person who has spent an entire lifetime being told that his suffering carries sacred meaning, this particular idea lands as genuinely electrifying news. And so the great comforting weight of your civilization, the church, is steady, reassuring insistence that everyone simply stay exactly where they are, is quietly cracking, even as the incense continues to burn undisturbed in every drawing room in the empire. Faith itself remains everywhere. But faith specifically in the eternal rightness of the existing order is leaking away in places you cannot easily see. Nowhere is this quiet crisis of faith stranger, or more visible, than at the very top of the empire, inside the imperial family itself, where desperation has invited a wild, unwashed holy man directly into the heart of imperial power. It is, at last, time to meet him properly. Every glittering court requires its scandal, and yours has produced an especially extraordinary one, because near the very center of imperial authority sits a wild-eyed, unwashed peasant mystic named Rasputin. He has earned the fierce, unshakable devotion of the Tsarina because he alone seems capable of easing the suffering of her desperately ill son, the heir to the entire throne. To her, he is nothing short of a living miracle. To the horrified aristocracy watching from a careful distance, he is a stain, a grubby charlatan whispering directly into the ear of empire, and a glaring symbol that something at the very top has gone deeply, alarmingly wrong. The gossip surrounding him spreads endlessly and grows increasingly poisonous with each retelling. His influence feels, to those who notice it, like a crack slowly climbing up the wall of an otherwise magnificent house. And the simple fact that the rot has reached this high should trouble you considerably more than it currently does. It is worth understanding exactly how he arrived there, because underneath the scandal lies something genuinely tragic. The heir to the throne, the young boy on whom the entire future of the dynasty ultimately rests, suffers from a severe, incurable blood disorder, one that transforms even the smallest injury into a genuine, life-threatening emergency, and subjects the child to episodes of agonizing, unrelenting pain. The finest physicians available anywhere in the empire can do essentially nothing to help him. Try for a moment to imagine the sheer terror of that for any parent, and then imagine that terror magnified enormously by the knowledge that this one fragile child represents the single point on which an entire empire's future precariously balances. Into that pit of helpless dread steps Rasputin, and somehow, whether through suggestion, through calm, through some quality nobody has ever satisfactorily explained, he appears able to soothe the boy in moments when no one else on earth can. To the boy's mother, this makes him nothing less than a man personally sent by God, the one person alive who can protect her son, and therefore a man to be trusted absolutely, defended fiercely, and kept close regardless of whatever anyone else might say. Her devotion to him becomes total and unshakable. And because she holds considerable influence over her husband, and her husband happens to rule the entire empire, this obscure Siberian mystic, with his piercing gaze and increasingly fearsome reputation, finds himself holding a direct line of influence running straight into the throne room itself. To your own class, this is nothing short of a horror and a genuine humiliation. The aristocracy is scandalized down to its very foundations. Here stands this coarse, unwashed, allegedly debauched figure, a man of no birth whatsoever and precious few manners, wielding a degree of influence the greatest noble families in the empire can only privately dream of. The stories about him multiply endlessly and grow steadily darker with each retelling. Tales of drunkenness, of seduction, of some sinister, half-understood power. Some of it is true. A great deal of it is invented outright. All of it, true or false, proves genuinely corrosive to the standing of the Imperial family, because every whispered rumor about Rasputin doubles, inevitably, as a rumor about the family that continues to tolerate him, and therefore about the basic fitness of the entire regime to keep ruling at all. That, in the end, is precisely what makes him so much more than a mere scandal. Rasputin functions as a symptom. His mere presence at the heart of imperial power is a visible sign, plain to anyone paying attention, that something has gone badly, unmistakably wrong at the very summit of the empire, that the supposedly sacred imperial family is frightened, confused, and increasingly out of touch, clinging to a mystic while the country around them strains audibly at every seam. The old magic that once made the throne feel entirely untouchable is visibly failing. If a figure like this can worm his way so completely into the center of power, people are quietly beginning to wonder, then perhaps the center itself is not quite so sacred, not quite so solid, not quite so eternal as everyone has always assumed. And that particular thought, once it takes hold in enough minds, proves considerably more dangerous than any single pamphlet ever could. Which brings us finally to the throne itself, and to the uncomfortable truth about the exact place your entire class has spent its whole life longing to stand. Proximity to the imperial family represents the absolute summit of everything your class strives toward, and it is also, though nobody in these rooms would ever say so directly, functioning as a slow-acting poison. To stand close to the Tsar is to bask openly in his reflected light, to gain favor, wealth, and standing almost automatically. But Tsar Nicholas II is, by most honest accounts, a gentle, stubborn, and tragically unsuited man, presiding over a country straining visibly at every seam, and he either cannot see the danger clearly or, more troublingly, simply refuses to. To stand near him now is to stand very close to the exact spot where the empire is quietly, steadily preparing to break apart. The higher you climb toward that throne, the further you will eventually have to fall, and when the fall finally comes, and it is coming, the people standing closest to the crown will be among the very first the storm reaches for. Let us speak honestly about the man occupying that throne, because so very much depends on him. Nicholas is, by most private accounts, a genuinely decent person in his personal life, a devoted husband and father, kind in his everyday dealings, sincere in his faith. He is also almost perfectly unsuited to the specific task of ruling the largest, most volatile empire on earth at the single most dangerous moment in its entire history. He is stubborn precisely where flexibility is desperately needed, and yielding precisely where firmness would serve him far better. He clings tightly to the conviction that he must preserve, intact, the full autocratic power he personally inherited, ruling exactly as his ancestors ruled, deaf to the steadily growing chorus insisting that the old ways can no longer possibly hold. He genuinely means well, and meaning well in his particular position proves nowhere near enough. He cannot see the danger clearly, or he simply refuses to look at it directly. Strains are visible everywhere, for anyone genuinely willing to look: the poverty, the mounting anger, the new and dangerous ideas, the cracks running steadily through every level of society. But Nicholas retreats again and again into the comfortable certainty that the Russian people love their Tsar unconditionally, that the current troubles are merely the work of a handful of agitators, and that if he simply holds firm and trusts in God, the storm will pass, exactly as storms always have before. It is a fatal misreading of the moment, and he clings to it with the quiet, immovable stubbornness of a man who genuinely cannot bear to consider any alternative. The captain refuses to believe the ship is sinking, and so he gives no order whatsoever to man the lifeboats. And you, along with your entire class, have organized your lives around getting as physically close to this particular man as humanly possible. Proximity to the crown remains the whole of the game. Remember, the ultimate source of favor, legitimacy, and meaning in your world. So the grandest families cluster ever more tightly around the throne, competing openly for its warmth, tying their own fortunes and futures more and more inextricably to the imperial family, and whatever fate ultimately awaits it. You have spent entire generations climbing steadily toward this particular summit. And now, here you finally are, near the very top, basking contentedly in the warmth of a sun that is, unknown to nearly everyone gathered around it, quietly preparing to go out. Consider carefully what that will eventually mean. When a genuine collapse finally arrives, it is never the anonymous people standing at the bottom who get singled out first. It is the ones at the top, the visible ones, the ones whose faces and family names have become permanently associated with the old order, the ones who stood closest to the crown and shared most directly in its glory. Your own proximity to the throne, the very thing you prize above nearly everything else in life, is quietly transforming, moment by moment, into a mark, a target, a liability that will one day be read aloud publicly like a formal charge. The nearer you stand to Nicholas now, the nearer you will inevitably stand to the center of the coming reckoning later. But you feel none of this warning, not yet. You feel only the warmth, that deep, genuine satisfaction of finally standing exactly where your family has always dreamed of standing. The storm remains a few years off still, and the sun, for the moment, still seems to shine steadily overhead. So you settle back comfortably into the pleasures of your gilded life, of which there remains still so much more to explore, beginning with the particular problem of boredom and the surprisingly destructive ways your class has learned to fill it. Here is a problem that no amount of money can ever solve. When you never have to work a single day of your life, the hours ahead of you become enormous, empty, and something inevitably has to fill them. For a great many members of your class, the answer turns out to be vice, conducted with impeccable taste. There is gambling capable of destroying entire family fortunes over the course of a single evening. There is drinking that begins earlier in the day than anyone present would ever openly admit. There are affairs, feuds, and elaborate romantic dramas pursued largely out of a desperate, unspoken hunger for something, anything at all, to actually happen. Boredom among the truly wealthy is not a small or trivial thing. It is a vast, aching void, and it drives otherwise capable people toward genuinely spectacular foolishness. You have, in every material sense, everything, and it turns out that having everything carries its own peculiar, private torment. So you deal another hand of cards, and you refill the glass once more. Consider honestly the shape of your typical day, once the dressing and the visiting and the elaborate social choreography have all been carefully stripped away. There is no work waiting for you anywhere, no task that genuinely must be completed, no real purpose pulling you reluctantly out of bed each morning beyond the simple maintenance of your own comfort. This sounds on paper like paradise to anyone who has ever done a real day's labor, and for roughly the first week, it genuinely is. After that, the emptiness begins, slowly and steadily, to press inward. A life entirely without necessary labor is a life with an enormous quantity of unstructured time to somehow fill, and filling that time turns out to be considerably harder than people who have never had too much of it tend to imagine. So you gamble, and you gamble seriously. The card table absorbs a genuinely staggering share of aristocratic energy, and the stakes involved are entirely real, ruinously, sometimes catastrophically real. Whole estates change hands over the course of a single bad evening. Fortunes carefully built up across several generations evaporate in one long night, because a bored nobleman simply could not stop, or would not, since the thrill of real risk was the only sensation that had made him feel genuinely alive in weeks. Men of your class have gambled away their family's entire future at those green baize tables, and the stories are retold afterward with a strange kind of awe, almost as though losing everything with sufficient style were itself some form of genuine achievement. And you drink. The drinking runs constant and begins early and is never quite openly acknowledged as any kind of problem, simply because absolutely everyone around you does it, so it settles quietly into becoming the background hum of aristocratic life. There is wine served with every meal, champagne poured for no particular reason at all, and stronger spirits following close behind. It fills the empty hours. It smooths over the boredom. It lends a pleasant, forgiving blur to a day that would otherwise stretch out ahead of you flat and entirely featureless. That certain members of your class are quietly, steadily destroying themselves. This way is understood perfectly well by everyone present and mentioned openly by essentially no one, because to mention it directly would be considered vulgar, and vulgarity remains the one genuine sin your world refuses to forgive. Then there are the manufactured dramas, the affairs, rivalries, and long-simmering feuds your class cultivates almost the way one might cultivate a rare, exotic plant, largely because they remain interesting, and there is otherwise so little else around to fill the space. When nothing genuinely needs to happen, people invariably manufacture events of their own, and the events they manufacture tend, more often than not, to be romantic or vengeful in nature. A single love affair can provide weeks of genuine intrigue. A well-nursed feud can provide months of it. These small dramas are pursued with an intensity that might even be admirable if it were directed towards something of real substance, and they absorb the enormous surplus of energy and emotion that an idle life otherwise leaves with absolutely nowhere else to go. It is, when you step back far enough to really examine it, a strange and rather sad spectacle. An entire class of clever, capable, energetic people, given everything imaginable, needing essentially nothing, and slowly rotting from the inside out for lack of any real purpose. You have been freed entirely from necessity, and it turns out that necessity was, all along, the very thing giving actual shape to human life. So you fill the resulting void with vodka, with cards, with manufactured passion, and you quietly call the result living. Meanwhile, some portion of that same restless, dangerous energy curdles into something considerably sharper. A touchy, prickly, almost obsessive fixation on personal honor, one capable of turning even the most trivial slight into a genuine matter of life and death. Your class clings fiercely to an old and lethal notion of honor, which sounds noble enough in the abstract, and in practice mostly means remaining willing to shoot a close friend over a single rude remark. An insult, real or entirely imagined, can escalate with startling speed into a formal duel fought at dawn, pistols raised in the cold morning air, seconds standing solemnly by, a physician waiting nearby to see precisely who ends up bleeding. Men genuinely die this way, over a disputed card game, over a woman, over a single sentence spoken in slightly the wrong tone at exactly the wrong party. It is a system that treats wounded pride as more valuable than life itself, and it is taken with absolute, deadly seriousness by everyone involved. It is, when examined plainly and without romance, completely insane. And it offers a genuinely useful preview of a class so thoroughly wrapped up in its own private rituals that it will go on defending its dignity long after every other meaningful thing it once possessed has already been lost. It is worth understanding exactly how the machinery of honor operates, because it is genuinely bizarre by any modern standard. A gentleman's reputation is treated as a sacred and remarkably fragile thing, and any perceived insult to it demands immediate satisfaction. A word that, in this specific context, means a formal opportunity to shoot, or be shot. The original offense itself may amount to almost nothing at all. A dismissive remark, a slight delivered at the card table, a rivalry over a particular woman, a tone of voice that struck the wrong ear at the wrong moment. But once the insult has been formally registered, an elaborate and rigid ritual grinds slowly into motion, and it proves extremely difficult to halt once begun, because refusing the duel outright brands a man a coward, and cowardice, in your world, is treated as a fate considerably worse than death itself, so the machinery proceeds methodically. Seconds are formally appointed, representatives tasked with negotiating the precise terms and occasionally, though rarely, finding some honorable path away from actual violence, though honor itself usually forbids exactly that. A time is fixed, typically at dawn. A location is chosen, somewhere quiet and appropriately discreet. Weapons are selected, most often pistols, and then two men, who may well have been genuine friends only the week before, stand a carefully measured distance apart in the cold morning air, raise their weapons and attempt, with full seriousness, to kill one another over a matter that, viewed from any sane distance whatsoever, was never worth a single drop of blood. People genuinely die in these encounters, or are permanently maimed, or carry the crushing guilt of having killed a close friend for the remainder of their own lives. The whole practice is defended, earnestly, as a necessary matter of principle, as the essential mechanism by which a gentleman's honor is protected and society's manners are kept properly sharp. But look closely at what it actually amounts to: a ritualized method of dying over wounded pride, an unspoken agreement among the privileged that their personal dignity is a more precious commodity than their own continued existence. It is the underlying logic of a class with far too much idle time, far too much self-regard, and nowhere near enough genuine perspective, taken here to its ultimate, lethal conclusion. And there is something genuinely revealing buried inside it, something that will echo forward, unmistakably, in everything still to come. The duel reveals a class willing to defend its honor to the literal death, one that ranks the mere appearance of dignity above simple survival itself. This is a group of people trained, quite literally from birth, to believe that how they are perceived by others matters more than almost anything else in existence, that the forms and rituals of their social status are genuinely worth dying for. It is a beautiful, absurd, and ultimately deeply self-destructive value system, and it does not prepare you at all well for a coming future in which plain, unglamorous survival becomes the only thing that matters. Because that future is coming, and it will not care in the slightest about your honor. It will not accept a fine jewel in payment, or respect an old title, or pause politely for a matter of correct etiquette. It will simply arrive, enormous and entirely indifferent, and it will ask without ceremony whether you can adapt, whether you can bend, whether you can genuinely survive. And a class that would rather be shot outright than merely slighted is not, as it turns out, a class especially well built for bending. The ideas that will eventually bring that particular future crashing down are already here, already spreading steadily, already quietly climbing the back staircases of your very own home. It is time, finally, to take them seriously. The single most frightening thing currently residing inside your household is not a person at all. It is an idea, and it has already, quietly, let itself in. New political philosophies are spreading through the empire like a slow fever, ideas concerning equality, concerning the rights of workers, concerning the wholesale abolition of everything your entire life has been carefully built upon. And these ideas do not politely remain confined to the slums where you have long assumed they belong. They travel freely. They arrive folded inside newspapers and cheaply printed pamphlets. They are whispered among university students, and they may, this very moment, already be living quietly inside the mind of the clever young tutor currently teaching your children their French verbs. Your own servants are listening far more closely than you have ever bothered to realize. The educated middle class is steadily turning against families exactly like yours. And the ground itself is shifting slowly beneath your polished parquet floors, even as your class continues dancing, night after night, right up until the very moment the music finally, permanently stops. Let us name plainly what is actually spreading, without getting too lost in doctrinal detail, because the underlying force of the thing matters considerably more than its finer technical points. New ways of thinking about society are steadily taking root across the empire, ideas insisting that the current arrangement, with its tiny wealthy elite perched at the top and its vast impoverished majority spread out beneath, is not natural, not eternal, and not divinely ordained, but rather a system of injustice built deliberately by human beings, and therefore fully capable of being dismantled by human beings in turn. Some of these ideas remain genuinely moderate, calling simply for gradual reform. Others are considerably more radical, calling for the entire structure to be overturned outright and rebuilt from nothing, with workers and peasants placed firmly on top, and families exactly like yours simply abolished from the social order altogether. And these particular ideas prove astonishingly mobile. You have likely assumed, if you have thought about it at all, that dangerous ideas of this kind remain safely confined to factory districts and impoverished villages, comfortably far from your own drawing rooms. This is a fatal misunderstanding of precisely how ideas actually spread. They travel on cheap printed paper, in pamphlets and forbidden newspapers passed quietly from hand to hand. They are carried by students, by workers who have only recently learned to read, by the restless and increasingly educated young who have absorbed them fully and now burn to spread them further still. They cross every boundary you once assumed would safely contain them, including, unfortunately, the boundary of your own front door. Because the people living and working inside your house are neither deaf nor foolish, and they have every reason on earth to listen closely. Your own servants, moving invisibly through your rooms day after day, hearing absolutely everything, watching the gap between your life and theirs widen visibly with every passing year, are precisely the audience these particular ideas were made for. The empire's growing class of educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, look up at the glittering, largely useless aristocracy above them, and increasingly find the entire arrangement absurd and deeply unjust. Even the clever foreign tutor currently shaping your own children's young minds may well carry sympathies that would genuinely horrify you, if only you knew. The coming rebellion is not gathering somewhere safely distant. It is gathering all around you, quietly, inside the very people your entire comfortable existence depends on. And this, in the end, is the real tragedy giving the whole story its shape. Your class does not see it coming, or else simply refuses to, right up until the very end. You continue on with the balls and the card games and the jewels and the fashionable health cures abroad, treating the rising rumble beneath everything as mere background noise, a problem belonging to someone else, a passing phase certain to fade on its own. You keep dancing, because dancing is the one thing your entire world genuinely knows how to do, and because pausing to look honestly at what is actually coming would require openly admitting that your whole existence rests on foundations that are already, quietly, crumbling beneath you. But ideas, once truly loose in the world, cannot simply be recalled. And this particular set of ideas carries a specific and ultimately violent trajectory. It has, in fact, already attempted once before to bring your entire world down in one great convulsion. Your class managed, that first time, to survive it, and then proceeded, catastrophically, to forget the whole experience almost entirely. That earlier convulsion was the warning, the rehearsal, the dress run for the real performance still to come. Nobody in your world bothered to properly read it. Let us return to that earlier moment now, because everything that follows was written there in plain enough language, if only anyone had cared to look. Here is the single fact that ought to terrify you more than any other. You have, quite genuinely, already been warned once before. Back in 1905, the entire empire convulsed violently. Crowds marched in the streets. Workers across the country went on strike. Sailors mutinied outright. Blood ran freely in the streets when soldiers opened fire on crowds who had gathered peacefully. For one genuine moment, it looked very much as though the whole structure might come crashing down right then and there. It did not. Concessions were hastily offered. A parliament of sorts was promised. The immediate pressure eased considerably, and your class breathed a long, relieved sigh and went directly back to its balls and its jeweled Easter eggs, treating the entire episode as an unpleasant but thoroughly finished chapter, now safely behind everyone. It was not, in fact, behind you at all. It was a rehearsal. The house shook violently, real cracks appeared across its foundation, and everyone involved simply agreed tacitly to paper cheerfully over them. The second time the house shakes, it will not stop shaking until it has fallen completely. Let us return properly to that fateful year, because it explains everything still to come. The underlying trouble had been building for a very long time already, the deep poverty, the mounting anger, the steady spread of new ideas, and in 1905 it finally broke the surface entirely. It began, in part, with a large crowd of ordinary factory workers approaching the Imperial palace peacefully, hopping to petition their own czar, whom many of them still genuinely trusted at that point as a kind of distant father figure. They arrived humbly, carrying religious icons, full of hope, and they were met instead with gunfire. Soldiers opened fire on an unarmed crowd, and people died in the snow that day, and something precious and genuinely irreplaceable died alongside them. The old, deep-rooted popular faith that the Tsar truly loved his people and would reliably protect them. From that single wound, the entire empire seemed to erupt almost simultaneously. Workers walked off the job in coordinated strikes across the country, shutting down factories and railways alike. Peasants rose openly against their landlords in scattered regions. Even parts of the military mutinied outright, most famously the crew of a great naval battleship, whose rebellion has since become the stuff of legend. For a period stretching across several months, the entire machinery of the imperial state seemed genuinely to be seizing up, the authority of the throne visibly wavering, and it truly did appear for a time, as though the entire existing order, your entire order, might be swept away then and there. The house did not merely shake that year. It swayed violently, and for one terrible, extended moment it seemed genuinely on the verge of collapse. But it did not fall, and the reason it did not fall is the essential key to understanding the whole coming tragedy. The regime, thoroughly frightened, gave meaningful ground. Concessions were formally offered. There would be an elected assembly of sorts, along with promises of broader reform sufficient in the end to divide the opposition and allow the most dangerous pressure to gradually escape. The strikes eventually wound down. The mutinies were forcibly crushed. Order was slowly, painstakingly restored, and the immediate crisis finally passed. The throne survived, wounded but still fundamentally intact, and your class survived comfortably right alongside it. And it is precisely here that your world made its single, fatal, unforgivable choice. Having survived the earthquake, it quietly decided the earthquake had not, in the end, really meant very much at all. The hard-won concessions were slowly hollowed out from within. The promised reforms were gradually watered down, or simply reversed outright. The new parliament was deliberately kept weak, and repeatedly dissolved whenever it grew inconvenient. And the aristocracy, thoroughly relieved by the whole outcome, simply returned to business exactly as it had been before, back to the balls, back to the diamonds, back to the comfortable, convenient assumption that the entire storm had been little more than an unfortunate aberration rather than an urgent, unmistakable warning. You treated a genuine near-death experience as nothing more than a stretch of bad luck, and you learned, collectively, absolutely nothing from it. That was the truly unforgivable error, the wasted warning. The events of 1905 had already demonstrated, in perfectly unmistakable terms, exactly what was still coming, and exactly how it would eventually arrive. Through hunger, through strikes, through soldiers who would one day finally refuse to fire on their own countrymen, through a broken faith in the Tsar that no amount of reform could ever fully repair. All of it sat there, fully readable, waiting patiently to be understood. And your class, having been handed the rarest possible gift, an early detailed preview of its own eventual destruction, chose instead to look away entirely and simply repaint the visible cracks. The next time this house shakes, there will be no clever concession left capable of saving it. And that next, far more violent shake is already on its way, brought on by a catastrophe your entire world is about to stumble into with truly breathtaking, unearned confidence: a full-scale European war. Then comes the summer of 1914, and the great powers of Europe collectively stumble into a war so vast, so thoroughly mechanized that nothing touched by it will emerge unchanged, least of all you and everyone you know. At first there is a strange, genuine flush of excitement, a wave of patriotic feeling sweeping across the country. Young aristocrats rush eagerly to become dashing military officers. Everyone involved feels quite certain the whole affair will prove glorious and mercifully brief. It proves to be neither. It is endless, and it is a slaughter on a scale the world has genuinely never witnessed before, and Russia pours millions of its own sons directly into it. The war devours money, food, fuel, and faith in roughly equal measure. It exposes, mercilessly, every single weakness lurking inside the empire, every incompetence, every rotten support beam quietly holding up the entire roof. Your comfortable world has always assumed it possessed all the time in the world. The war is about to inform you, in the coldest and most unambiguous terms imaginable, that it most certainly does not. The beginning of it all feels, cruelly, almost festive. When the war first breaks out, a genuine wave of patriotic feeling sweeps across the entire country, and for one brief, deceptive moment, it even seems to unite the whole fractured empire behind its czar. The young men of your own class are thoroughly thrilled by the prospect. War, in their understanding, is glorious, a genuine adventure, a long-awaited chance for honor and heroism of precisely the kind their entire upbringing has spent years quietly celebrating. They rush eagerly to take up military commissions, splendid in freshly tailored uniforms, thoroughly certain they will win quick, decisive victories and be safely home again, garlanded with honors, before the autumn leaves have finished falling. It is, in essence, the entire honor culture of the private duel scaled up abruptly to the size of a continent, and it is about to collide, violently, with reality. Reality, in this case, is the modern industrial battlefield, and it has no genuine interest in glory of any kind. This war is unlike anything in prior human experience. A mechanized slaughter defined by machine guns, heavy artillery, and endless barbed wire, where individual courage counts for remarkably little against pure industrial killing power. And men die not in some heroic single combat but in their thousands, entirely anonymously, buried in the mud. Russia pours its own people directly into this furnace, millions upon millions of them, overwhelmingly peasant conscripts, poorly equipped and often badly led, sent forward to fight and die for reasons the great majority of them barely understand, let alone genuinely accept. The resulting casualties are staggering, well beyond ordinary comprehension. An entire generation is being steadily fed into the grinder, and the war accomplishes something considerably more dangerous than simply killing soldiers by the thousand. It places the entire empire under a strain it was never remotely built to bear, and in doing so it exposes, mercilessly, every single weakness the previous years of comfortable peace had managed to conceal. The sheer incompetence of the imperial leadership becomes genuinely impossible to hide any longer. The military supply system begins to fail outright. The national economy buckles visibly under an impossible financial burden. Every rotten support beam inside the old order, every weak floor quietly papered over during the comfortable years of peace, is suddenly bearing weight it was never designed to carry, and it begins, audibly now, to crack apart. Worst of all, by far, the war steadily drains away the last remaining reserves of public faith, faith in the basic competence of the government, as one defeat follows another in grim succession, faith in the Tsar himself, who eventually takes personal command of the army and thereby personally attaches his own name to every subsequent military disaster. faith in the entire arrangement, as ordinary people across the empire are asked to sacrifice absolutely everything: their sons, their food, their futures, while the glittering elite continues carrying on comfortably somewhere above them. The war is not merely a military catastrophe unfolding at the front. It is the great accelerant, the single force that takes every slow-building pressure of the preceding decades and drives it, all at once, directly to the boiling point. Your class has always assumed, as it has always assumed everything, that there remained plenty of time still ahead, that the old world would simply continue on, more or less indefinitely, that whatever troubles arose could always be managed and safely survived, exactly as 1905 had once been survived. The war ends that particular assumption forever. It is the hammer blow the already cracked house simply cannot absorb, and its effects do not remain politely confined to some distant front line. They come home instead, into the cities, into the streets, directly into the very heart of your own comfortable world, arriving in the unmistakable form of cold, gnawing hunger, and a rage that is, at long last, finally running out of patience. As the war grinds relentlessly onward, month after month, the glittering life you have always known begins visibly to curdle. Even here inside the capital, real shortages set in now, genuine ones. Bread grows scarce and then desperately scarce. Fuel for heating runs dangerously low. Long queues of exhausted, freezing, increasingly furious people stretch through the streets in the bitter cold. The wounded return home in truly unimaginable numbers. The casualty lists grow longer than anyone can reasonably bear to read in full. And the anger, that same slow, patient, fermenting anger drifting up from the villages and the factory floors for so many years, is no longer distant at all. It is here now, right in the capital, sharpened considerably by hunger and by grief, and by the unmistakable sight of your own class still somehow, attempting to hold its parties as though nothing at all had changed. When people are visibly starving in the snow directly outside a brightly lit palace window, they eventually, inevitably, stop simply looking through the glass. The shortages become, quite quickly, the first thing that genuinely cannot be ignored by anyone. The war has swallowed the country's material resources whole and thoroughly broken the systems that once reliably kept the cities fed and warm through winter. Bread, the most basic staple imaginable, grows scarce and then desperately scarce. Fuel to heat homes through the brutal winter months runs alarmingly short. And so the streets of the capital fill, day after day, with long queues, cold, exhausted, hungry people standing for hours in the freezing dark, uncertain whether even a single loaf will remain by the time they finally reach the front of the line. These are not abstract statistics tucked away in some official report. These are the capital's own residents, and their patience is being ground down, day by frozen day, to essentially nothing at all. Meanwhile, the war continues sending home its grim harvest. The wounded return in numbers nobody was ever remotely prepared for, filling hospitals and spilling out into the streets, visible everywhere as living evidence of the catastrophe still unfolding at the front. The lists of the dead grow steadily longer with every failed offensive, and nearly every family across the empire, especially among the peasants and workers who make up the overwhelming bulk of the army, finds itself touched directly by loss. Grief settles slowly over the entire country like a second, harder winter. And grief, mixed together with hunger and total exhaustion, forms an extremely combustible combination. And what precisely do these grieving, hungry people see when they finally lift their tired eyes from the endless bread queue? They see, unmistakably now, that not everyone around them is suffering in equal measure. They see that the glittering world at the top, though visibly diminished from its former glory, continues turning regardless, that there remains real comfort, even genuine luxury, glowing behind certain particular lit windows. Your class, reduced in circumstance but by no means entirely ruined, continues attempting to maintain something resembling its old life, its dinners, its diminished but still persistent version of former glamour. And in a starving city, that stubborn persistence reads as considerably more than merely tone-deaf. It reads as outright provocation. It becomes, quite literally, the spark held directly against the fuel. The gap between your world and the world of the streets, always vast, always present, has now become simultaneously wider and, crucially, far more visible than ever before. In the comfortable years, poverty existed somewhere else entirely, out in the distant villages, glimpsed briefly through a passing train window, easy enough to ignore altogether. Now it stands right outside, in the capital itself, in the freezing queues gathered beneath your very own windows, impossible to miss, and equally impossible to explain away. The careful insulation that protected your class so effectively for so many decades, that lovely, comfortable distance, has finally, completely collapsed. The two rushes are now standing together in the very same cold street, and one of them, at long last, is armed with a rage that has finally found its proper target. This cannot hold much longer, and it does not. There is only so long that a hungry, grieving, thoroughly exhausted population will continue queuing quietly in the snow, while the old order fumbles helplessly, and the glittering few carry serenely on. The pressure has built well past every reasonable limit. All that remains now is the trigger, that particular bitterly cold week when the queues finally transform into crowds, and the crowds transform, in turn, into something the regime can no longer contain by any means available to it. That week is coming, and when it finally arrives, 300 years of imperial rule will unravel at a speed that leaves absolutely everyone, your own class most of all, genuinely, thoroughly stunned. Then in the bitter cold of early 1917, it finally happens, not with some grand, decisive battle, but with bread queues, scattered strikes, and soldiers who simply refuse, at last, to fire on the crowds gathered before them. In a matter of days, faster than almost anyone alive believed possible, the entire imperial edifice that has stood for 300 years simply collapses under its own exhausted weight. The Tsar, the sacred center of your entire universe, abdicates. Just like that, the throne stands empty. The unthinkable has, quite suddenly, become the morning's news. Your class stands blinking in the sudden, ringing silence where an empire used to be, still half convinced that surely any day now someone will step forward and restore proper order, that this is simply another 1905, another episode destined to be quietly painted over. It is not. This time, the house is genuinely coming down and you are still standing inside it. Notice how ordinary it all looks at the start, because the sheer ordinariness of it is genuinely astonishing in hindsight. There is no dramatic foreign invasion, no grand rebel army marching triumphantly on the capital. There are only the pressures that have been quietly building for years finally converging, all at once, in one bitterly cold week. The bread queues, the strikes, as factory workers walk out en masse. Street demonstrations that swell day by day into genuinely enormous crowds. At first it looks like the kind of unrest the regime has weathered many times before, the sort of disturbance that has always, eventually, been contained by a sufficient show of force. Everyone assumes, almost reflexively, that the soldiers will step in and restore order, exactly as soldiers always have. That assumption is about to prove catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, because this time the soldiers do not fire. Ordered to turn their weapons on the crowd, the troops, many of them war-weary conscripts who share the very same hunger and fury as the demonstrators facing them, simply refuse. They lower their rifles. They begin fraternizing openly with the crowd. Some of them join it outright. And in that single moment, the one true pillar the entire regime has always ultimately rested upon, the willingness of armed men to fire on their own countrymen when ordered to do so, simply gives way beneath everyone's feet. Without that pillar, the throne has nothing what's-ever left holding it up. The whole vast apparatus of imperial authority, which had always seemed so permanent, so solid, so thoroughly blessed by God, turns out to have been resting the entire time on a foundation that has just, quietly, walked away, and then, with a speed that stuns observers across the entire world. It is simply over. The Tsar, away from the capital at the time, isolated and now abandoned by his own generals and ministers alike, is finally advised that he can no longer meaningfully hold power, and he abdicates. 300 years of dynastic rule end, not with any kind of heroic last stand, but with a tired man's signature on a single document. A man surrendering a throne that has, in truth, already dissolved beneath him days before. The sacred center of your entire universe, the ultimate source of all legitimacy, the very summit your class spent generations climbing steadily toward, is simply gone. The seat sits empty. The unthinkable has become a plain, unremarkable fact reported quietly in the morning papers. Your class receives this news in a state of profound disbelief. Surely, you tell yourselves, this cannot possibly be permanent. Surely order will be restored soon enough. Some strong hand will inevitably emerge. Some workable new arrangement will be reached, and the essential structure of things, however modified at the edges, will endure regardless. You reach instinctively for the comforting memory of 1905, when the house shook violently and in the end steadied itself. You assume, quite naturally, that this is simply another such shaking, frightening, certainly but ultimately survivable, a crisis to be carefully managed and then, in time, quietly forgotten and painted over. You are, this final time, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, because this is not 1905. There will be no clever concession available this time, no reform sufficient to release the mounting pressure, no eventual return to the comfortable old normal. The throne is not merely wounded on this occasion. It is entirely gone, and it is not coming back. The old world has ended cleanly and completely within the span of a few bitterly cold days, and into the resulting vacuum, into the chaos, the confusion, and the desperate, fragile hope of a country that has just torn out its own foundation, something new is already beginning to move. Something disciplined, ruthless, and utterly unlike anything your fumbling, dazed class is remotely equipped to survive. The chaos that follows does not settle comfortably into anything resembling stability. Later that same year, a small, tightly disciplined, and absolutely ruthless political faction seizes power outright, moving with a clarity of purpose your own hesitant class never remotely possessed. They do not want to gently reform your world. They want to abolish it entirely, root and branch. And they mean this in a way you are not remotely equipped to fully understand. Private property, noble titles, vast inherited estates, the entire architecture of your existence is formally declared finished, illegitimate over. Everything you were, everything you owned, everything your ancestors spent generations building, hoarding, and passing carefully down is dissolved, essentially overnight, by simple decree. There is no negotiating with any of this. There is no charming your way out of it with impeccable French and a perfectly raised eyebrow. The world has not merely changed around you. The world you belong to has been formally, officially declared to have never possessed any legitimate right to exist in the first place. Understand, first, exactly what filled the sudden gap left behind after the throne finally fell. The abdication itself did not produce any real order. It produced instead a fragile, well-meaning but genuinely weak provisional arrangement, attempting somehow to govern an enormous country still in the middle of a catastrophic war, while every single underlying problem that had brought down the Tsar in the first place remained entirely unsolved. The hunger did not end. The war dragged wearily on. The chaos, if anything, deepened further. And in that swirling, dangerous uncertainty, with the old authority gone entirely and the new authority proving far too feeble to hold, the field lay wide open for whichever group possessed the discipline, the clarity of purpose, and the sheer ruthlessness necessary to seize it outright. Your own class, thoroughly disoriented and purely reactive, possessed none of these qualities in any useful measure. Another group, waiting patiently in the wings, possessed all three in abundance. That group takes full power later in the year, in a second upheaval that decisively finishes what the first one only began. They are organized where nearly everyone else remains hopelessly confused, decisive where everyone else continues to hesitate, and absolutely certain of their ultimate aims where almost everyone else is simply struggling day to day to survive. And their aims, it quickly becomes clear, are not remotely modest. They have no interest whatsoever in merely tinkering with the old system, in reforming it gently, in reaching some workable compromise that preserves a comfortable place for families exactly like yours. Their stated goal is total transformation, the complete, permanent abolition of the old order entirely, and the construction of something genuinely new in its place, built deliberately on principles standing in precise, direct opposition to everything your world has always represented. And so the formal decrees begin arriving, one after another, and each one erases a further piece of your entire reality. Private ownership of land, the very foundation of your family's accumulated wealth, is abolished outright. The great estates are ordered seized and redistributed among the peasantry. Noble titles, the essential currency of your entire social existence, are declared meaningless, void, finished. The careful distinctions of rank and inherited birth that once ordered your whole life are legislated out of existence entirely, piece by piece, with nothing more than the simple stroke of a pen, and not gradually, not gently, but with the swift, unmistakable finality of people who have waited a very long time for exactly this moment, and fully intend to make it stick permanently. There is, quite simply, no meaningful defense against any of this, and that particular fact is the one thing your class genuinely cannot absorb. Every single skill you possess proves entirely useless here. You cannot charm your way out of a formal decree. You cannot deploy your flawless French, your perfect manners, your intimate knowledge of court precedents and etiquette against people who regard all of it not as impressive at all, but as direct evidence of your guilt. The very qualities that made you admired throughout the old world now mark you unmistakably as a target within the new one: your refinement, your inherited privilege, your former proximity to the fallen throne. All of it now marks you not as elevated, but as condemned outright. The deepest shock of all, though, is not simply that you have lost your wealth and your former status. It is the discovery that the new order declares, formally, that you never possessed any legitimate right to either in the first place, that your entire existence represented a crime committed against the ordinary people of your own country, that the glittering world you once belonged to was never a legitimate civilization brought tragically low, but rather an injustice finally, properly corrected after far too long. Your world did not simply end. It was retroactively convicted. And the people who once ran it, people exactly like you, are now assigned an entirely new and genuinely dangerous identity, a label that instantly transforms your entire glittering past into both a mark of shame and a source of real, mortal danger. There is a chilling new phrase now applied to people exactly like you. You are, in the new order's language, a former person, not an aristocrat any longer, not a lady, not a gentleman, but a former one, a relic of a condemned age, stripped bare of your property, your title, your accustomed protection, and increasingly even your basic physical safety. Your palace is seized outright. Your possessions are confiscated or simply scattered to the wind. Your family name, once a passport granting entry into every gilded room in the entire empire, has become, almost overnight, a genuine liability, one capable of getting you arrested, or worse. The terror that follows in these months is entirely real and entirely merciless. Simply being who you once were has suddenly become one of the single most dangerous things a person in this country can possibly be. All that carefully cultivated beauty, all that inherited privilege, all that painstaking training and elegant uselessness. And now the single most useful skill imaginable would be the simple ability to become invisible. A skill, of course, you were never once taught. Sit for a moment with that particular phrase, because it captures the entire situation with unsettling precision. A former person, no longer a person fully in their own right, but merely the leftover remnant of something that has been formally abolished, a human relic of a thoroughly discredited past. It is a designation that strips away not merely your wealth, but your very standing as a full member of this new society. Former people are pushed, systematically, to the very bottom of every list. Denied rations, denied ordinary work, denied the basic protections extended to everyone else, marked out clearly as belonging to the defeated enemy class. The class that has now been overthrown, and is, in the eyes of the new order, simply receiving precisely what it has long deserved. The material collapse itself is total. And it arrives with startling speed. Your palace, that same freezing monument you woke inside so many long chapters of this story ago, is seized, requisitioned, handed over entirely to others or repurposed altogether for new uses. Your possessions, the jewels, the furs, the art, the small imperial-grade treasures collected over generations, are confiscated, scattered, sold off piecemeal, or simply taken outright. The estates, the land itself, the true original source of your family's entire fortune, all of it gone. In a stunningly short span of time, a family that spent centuries carefully accumulating wealth finds itself left with nothing at all, or perhaps only what can be hastily carried, hidden, or sewn desperately into the lining of a traveling coat in the fragile hope of somehow getting it safely out of the country. And your name, the single thing you once prized above almost everything else in this life, undergoes the most terrible transformation of all. Once, your family name opened every gilded door without exception, announcing your worth before you had even spoken a single word. Now it does precisely the opposite. Now it marks you clearly. To be identified as an aristocrat, a noble, a member of some former great family, is to be flagged unmistakably as an enemy of the new order. And in the climate of genuine terror now descending across the country, that particular flag can mean arrest, imprisonment, or death. The very identity your family spent generations carefully building and polishing has become, almost overnight, the single most dangerous thing you now possess. You spend your remaining days trying desperately to shed it, to hide it, to disappear quietly into being no one at all. But here, finally, sits the last, bitter irony the entire story has been steadily building toward. In this stark new world, where survival has been stripped down to its absolute bare essentials, the single most valuable thing any person could possibly possess is the simple ability to be useful, to labor, to work with one's own hands, to blend seamlessly into the ordinary mass of people simply trying to get by. And that, of course, is the one thing your entire class was never, ever taught. Your beautiful, thoroughly useless education, your soft, uncalloused hands, your fluent French, your exquisite manners, your carefully cultivated helplessness. All of it is now not merely worthless, but actively, dangerously incriminating, a set of glaring signals marking you out as exactly the kind of person the new order is actively hunting. The peasant who knows how to grow a potato, the ordinary worker who knows how to repair a machine. These people possess skills that translate directly into survival. You possess the ability to recite poetry fluently in 4 languages and correctly identify a fine vintage from 50 paces. You are prepared, with enormous care and considerable expense, for a world that no longer exists at all, and left entirely, catastrophically unprepared for the harsh one that has replaced it. For those who manage to escape, and a great many do not, there awaits exile, and exile proves to be its own strange, quietly sad afterlife. The survivors scatter outward across Europe to Paris, to Berlin, and well beyond, carrying with them whatever small jewels they managed to sew into their coats before fleeing, along with a lifetime's worth of skills now worth, in practical terms, essentially nothing. So the truly astonishing final image of your entire vanished world slowly takes shape. Years later, in the cafes of Paris, countesses working quietly as seamstresses, former colonels waiting tables for tips, and on occasion genuine grand dukes, men who once stood within easy reach of an imperial throne, now driving taxicabs through the rain, telling passengers stories that sound, frankly, like elaborate fairy tales, simply because, to modern ears, they genuinely are. You survive in the end. But the entire world that once gave your existence its meaning is now gone forever, dissolved quietly into memory, into rumor, into the faint, fatting scent of a perfume nobody manufactures any longer. You were once rich in the Russian Empire, and in the end, that particular fact turned out to be the single most dangerous thing you could possibly have been. The escape itself, for those fortunate enough to manage it, is a genuinely harrowing ordeal. A desperate flight across a country descending into chaos, carrying whatever little can realistically be carried, bribing and hiding at every turn, running steadily toward any border that offers even the faintest possibility of a way out. Some carry jewels sewn carefully into the linings of their traveling clothes, the last liquid remnant of what was once a vast family fortune, destined to be sold off slowly abroad simply to fund a modest life in exile. Many carry nothing whatsoever beyond their own lives and the clothes still on their backs. And a great many others do not make it out of the country at all, caught up in the surrounding terror, lost somewhere in the chaos of the civil war that follows, vanished quietly into a history that never bothered to record their individual names. Those who do reach safety are, relatively speaking, the fortunate ones, if fortunate is even remotely the right word to use here. They gather together in the great cities of Europe, in Paris above all others, in Berlin, in Constantinople, wherever displaced immigrés could reasonably land and cluster together, attempting to reassemble some small fragment of the world they have irretrievably lost. And in exile they discover, fully and completely, the cruel weight of everything the earlier chapters of their lives had quietly warned them about. Their titles mean nothing whatsoever here. Their estates are gone forever, beyond any hope of recovery. Their fortunes, unless carefully sewn into a coat lining beforehand, are simply, permanently lost. And their carefully cultivated skills, beautiful, ornamental, painstakingly acquired over years of expensive tutoring, turn out to be worth almost nothing whatsoever in a world that expects ordinary people to actually work for their daily living. So the images multiply, one after another, and they remain genuinely unforgettable precisely because every one of them is entirely true. Aristocratic women once dressed each morning by entire armies of servants now sit stitching quietly for their supper, their fine needlework turning out to be the one genuinely useful thing all those years of ornamental education ever actually left them with. Former officers who once commanded entire regiments now wait tables in modest restaurants, quietly remembering. And most famously of all, genuine members of the very highest nobility, men who once stood within arm's reach of the imperial throne itself, are found driving taxicabs through the wet Paris streets, ferrying complete strangers from place to place, and sometimes, if a passenger happens to ask, telling them quietly about the palaces, the balls, and the jeweled golden eggs, stories so extravagant that most passengers simply assume they must be invented entirely. But they are not invented at all. That, in the end, is precisely the whole point of the story. The taxi driver really was a Grand Duke. The seamstress really was a countess. The waiter really did once command men in a war that helped, in the end, to bring his entire world crashing down. They carry within them, quietly, the memory of an entire vanished civilization, a world of impossible glamour and equally impossible blindness, one that burned brilliantly for a short while, and then, within the span of only a few years, ceased to exist altogether. They survived it in the end. But survival, as it turns out, is never quite the same thing as being spared, because the world that once gave their individual lives real meaning is now entirely gone, and no amount of quiet remembering can ever fully bring it back. And so we arrive, at last, at the strange, quiet truth sitting at the very center of this entire long story. Being wealthy in the Russian Empire during the 1910s was never actually the safe, enviable, permanent condition it so convincingly appeared to be from the inside. It was, instead, a beautiful position perched right at the very top of a structure that was, the entire time, already quietly crumbling beneath it. And when that structure finally gave way completely, the very height that had once seemed such an extraordinary blessing became, instead, the longest and most dangerous fall imaginable. You woke that particular morning in 1913, buried beneath a mountain of imported linen in a freezing, magnificent palace, attended by a silent army of servants, dressed piece by an entire committee, fed like a small private festival, and carried gently through an endless glittering world of balls and diamonds and jeweled golden eggs. You spoke fluent French to people who themselves spoke Russian. You danced across polished floors suspended somewhere above a country you never once truly saw. You climbed steadily, exactly as your family had always dreamed of climbing, toward the warm, inviting light of the throne. And then, quietly at first, and then all at once, the entire beautiful structure came crashing down around you, and you learned in the end the strangest lesson of this whole long night. That in that particular time and that particular place, being genuinely rich was very possibly the single most dangerous thing a person could ever be. It is a peculiar kind of story, in the end, not really a tale of humble people patiently enduring hardship, but rather one of deeply privileged people discovering, far too late, that privilege was never quite the same thing as genuine safety. The peasants you barely noticed. The servants who watched you far more closely than you ever imagined. The vast, patient country stretching out beyond your frosted window, decade after decade, all of them carried the true weight of that entire age, and a great many of them ultimately carried it forward into a future that, at truly terrible cost, finally, unmistakably belonged to them. So tonight, as you settle quietly into your own warm bed, in a home you can heat comfortably with nothing more than the simple turn of a dial, in a world where your worth is never measured by your bloodline, and your basic safety never once depends on the shifting mood of a crowd outside your window, perhaps spare a soft, quiet thought for all of them, the fallen and the risen alike, the ones who danced, and the ones who stood outside watching. History in the end is grand and cruel, and gently, quietly absurd all at the same time. Sleep well.